Jamie Dimon's early career, from beginning to the firing of 1998, Part 1. Family background and early influences. The story of Jamie Dimon does not begin in a corner office on Wall Street or in the mahogany-paneled boardrooms of American finance. It begins, as so many great American stories do, with immigrants, with a family that crossed an ocean carrying little more than ambition, resilience, and an unshakable belief that hard work could rewrite the terms of one's existence. To understand the man who would eventually become the most powerful banker in the world, one must first understand the world that made him. A Greek-American household in Queens, New York, where the dinner table was a classroom, where finance was discussed with the same passion other families reserved for sports or religion, and where the expectations placed on children were as heavy and nourishing as the Mediterranean food that filled their plates. Roots in the Old World. The Dimon family's American journey began with Jamie's paternal grandfather, Panos Papadimitriou, who emigrated from Greece to the United States in the early 20th century. Like countless other Greek immigrants who arrived on American shores during that era, Papadimitriou carried with him the particular blend of industriousness and pride that characterized the Greek diaspora. Greece, at the turn of the century, was a nation of limited economic opportunity, and its sons and daughters scattered across the globe, to Australia, to South America, to the great cities of the American East Coast, seeking the prosperity that their homeland could not provide. Papadimitriou, now carrying the Dimon name, found his way into the financial world, working as a stockbroker. It was a remarkable trajectory for an immigrant, and it established a family tradition that would echo through generations. The financial markets, with their blend of intellectual rigor, competitive intensity, and potential for dramatic reward, seemed to resonate with something deep in the Dimon family character. The grandfather planted a seed, and it would grow in ways he could scarcely have imagined. Theodore Dimon, the father as first teacher. Jamie Dimon's father, Ted, known to most as Tact, inherited his own father's affinity for Wall Street and built upon it with considerable skill and dedication. Ted Dimon became a stockbroker at Shearson, one of the prominent brokerage firms of the mid-20th century. Shearson had a storied history in American finance, having grown through a series of mergers and acquisitions into a significant player in the securities business. Working there placed Ted Dimon squarely within the bloodstream of American capitalism, and the rhythms of the market, its euphoria and its panics, its rational calculations and its irrational exuberances, became the rhythms of the Dimon household. Ted Dimon was, by all accounts, a man of discipline and principle. He approached his work with the seriousness and professionalism that the brokerage business demanded, building relationships with clients, analyzing stocks, and navigating the complex emotional terrain that comes with managing other people's money. He was not a flamboyant Wall Street figure, not a Gordon Gekko type, not a swashbuckling deal-maker who made headlines. He was something perhaps more admirable, a steady, competent, deeply ethical professional who understood that the financial business, at its best, was a service profession built on trust. Clients entrusted their life savings, their retirement dreams, their children's college funds to men like Ted Dimon, and he took that responsibility with a gravity that his son would later absorb and carry into his own career. The influence of Ted Dimon on young Jamie cannot be overstated. In the Dimon household, finance was not an abstraction, it was the family trade, as tangible and present as flour in a baker's home or timber in a carpenter's shop. Jamie grew up hearing his father discuss markets, dissect investment decisions, and wrestle with the daily challenges of his profession. The language of Wall Street, stock prices, earnings reports, market trends, risk and reward, was part of the domestic vocabulary, as natural and familiar as any other topic of conversation. For many children, the world of finance remains mysterious and distant, something encountered only in adulthood. For Jamie Dimon, It was the air he breathed from his earliest years. Ted Dimon also modeled something crucial: the connection between intellectual engagement and professional success. He was a reader, a thinker, a man who believed that understanding the world, its economics, its politics, its human dynamics, was not merely a luxury, but a necessity for anyone who wanted to thrive. This intellectual curiosity, this restless desire to understand how things worked and why, became one of the defining characteristics of Jamie Dimon's own personality. Long before he set foot in any classroom of higher education, Jamie was being educated at home in the most fundamental sense, not just in the mechanics of finance, but in the habits of mind that would serve him throughout his life. Themis Dimon, the mother's strength. If Ted Dimon provided the professional template and the intellectual framework, Jamie's mother, Themis, provided something equally essential: emotional steel, high expectations, and the fierce, unyielding love that is the hallmark of Greek motherhood. Themis Dimon was a formidable presence in the household, intelligent, strong-willed, and deeply invested in her children's futures. She embodied the Greek immigrant tradition, in which education was regarded not merely as an opportunity, but as a sacred obligation, a debt owed to the ancestors who had sacrificed so that future generations might have chances they themselves never enjoyed. Greek-American families of the mid-20th century occupied a particular niche in the mosaic of American life. They were, as a community, remarkably successful in their adopted country, with disproportionate representation in business, medicine, law, and academia. This success was not accidental. It was the product of a culture that placed extraordinary emphasis on education, family cohesion, and entrepreneurial drive. The Greek Orthodox Church served as a community anchor, providing not just spiritual guidance, but social networks and a sense of collective identity. Greek American parents pushed their children relentlessly, not out of cruelty, but out of love and historical memory. The memory of poverty, of limited horizons, of a homeland that could not offer what America could. Themis Dimon was very much a product of this tradition. She expected excellence from her children, not perfection in the neurotic, anxiety-producing sense, but genuine effort, genuine engagement with learning, and a genuine commitment to being the best versions of themselves. Mediocrity was not acceptable, not because it would bring shame, but because it would represent a waste of the extraordinary potential and opportunity that life in America afforded. This expectation was communicated not through harsh punishment or authoritarian dictate, but through the daily texture of family life, through conversations, through encouragement, through the visible pride that came when a child excelled, and through the gentle but unmistakable disappointment that followed anything less than full effort. Growing up in Queens. James Dimon was born on March 13, 1956 in New York City, and he grew up in Queens, that vast, sprawling borough that has long served as one of the great crucibles of American diversity and ambition. Queens in the 1950s and 1960s was a place of remarkable ethnic richness, a patchwork quilt of neighborhoods where Greek families lived alongside Italian families, Irish families, Jewish families, and families from every other corner of the globe. It was a working-class and middle-class borough, a place where people labored hard for modest homes and modest comforts, and where success was measured not by inherited wealth or social pedigree, but by effort, determination, and results. Jamie was the middle of three brothers, a position in the family birth order that often produces individuals who are both competitive and socially adept, skilled at navigating between the authority of older siblings and the demands of younger ones. His brothers, Peter, the eldest, and Ted Jr., provided both companionship and competition, and the household dynamic was one of spirited engagement. The Dimon boys argued, debated, challenged one another, and pushed each other to excel. It was a household where passivity was nearly impossible. The energy was too high, the expectations too great, the intellectual stimulation too constant. The neighborhood itself contributed to Jamie's development. Queens in that era was a place where children still played in the streets, where neighbors knew one another's names, and where the rhythms of daily life were governed by school bells, dinner times, and the comings and goings of working parents. It was, in many ways, an ideal environment for building the kind of social intelligence that would later prove so valuable in business: the ability to read people, to understand motivations, to build alliances, and to navigate conflict. Jamie Dimon learned these skills not in a corporate training program, but on the sidewalks and playgrounds of Queens and the rough and tumble democracy of childhood. The dinner table as seminar room. Perhaps no single element of Jamie Dimon's upbringing was more consequential than the family dinner table. In the Dimon household, meals were not simply occasions for eating, they were forums for discussion, debate, and education. Ted Dimon brought home stories from Shearson, discussing the day's market movements, the performance of particular stocks, the strategies he was employing on behalf of his clients. These were not sanitized, dumbed-down versions of the financial world tailored for children's ears. They were real, substantive conversations about the complexities of investing, the psychology of markets, and the ethical obligations of handling other people's money. Jamie absorbed all of it. He was, even as a boy, intensely curious and remarkably quick-minded. He asked questions, probing, sometimes uncomfortable questions that revealed a mind already inclined toward analysis and skepticism. Why did this stock go up? Why did that investment fail? What did it mean when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates? How could you tell if a company's management was competent? These were not the questions of a child mechanically imitating adult conversation. They were the questions of a genuinely engaged young mind trying to make sense of a complex world. Ted Dimon, to his enormous credit, took his son's questions seriously. He did not dismiss them or deflect them with vague answers. He engaged with them, explained the reasoning behind his decisions, and was honest about the uncertainties and difficulties inherent in the financial business. This candor was itself a powerful lesson. Jamie learned early that the world of finance was not a realm of certainties and sure things. It was a domain of probabilities, of calculated risks, of judgments made under conditions of incomplete information. This understanding, internalized in childhood, would prove invaluable throughout his career. The dinner table conversations also introduced Jamie to a figure who would become enormously important in his life, though he would not meet the man in person for years. Ted Dimon worked at Shearson, and at Shearson there was a rising executive named Sanford "Sandy" Weill. Ted spoke of Weill with admiration, describing him as a brilliant, driven figure who was reshaping the firm with bold strategic moves and an unrelenting work ethic. The name Sandy Weill became familiar to Jamie Dimon long before the two men's paths would fatefully cross. In a sense, the seeds of one of the most consequential partnerships in American financial history were planted not in a conference room or a business school, but around a dinner table in Queens, in the stories a father told his son about the extraordinary people he encountered in his work. Values forged in two cultures. The Dimon household was a place where two powerful cultural currents merged: the Greek immigrant tradition and the American meritocratic ideal. From the Greek side came an emphasis on family loyalty, educational achievement, resilience in the face of adversity, and a deep-seated belief that one's word was one's bond. From the American side came the conviction that talent and effort could overcome any obstacle, that institutions and systems mattered, and that the marketplace, for all its imperfections, was the greatest engine of opportunity the world had ever known. These two currents reinforced each other in powerful ways. The Greek emphasis on education aligned perfectly with the American belief in meritocracy. The Greek tradition of enterprising endeavor found fertile soil in the American economic system. And the Greek respect for family, the idea that individual achievement was meaningful not just for oneself, but for the entire clan, gave Jamie Dimon's ambition a dimension that went beyond mere personal advancement. He was not just striving for himself, he was striving for his family, for his parents, for the lineage of immigrants who had crossed an ocean to give him this chance. Religion played a role as well, though perhaps not the dominant one. The Dimon family attended Greek Orthodox services, and the church provided a community framework, a network of Greek-American families who shared similar values, similar stories, and similar aspirations. The Greek Orthodox tradition, with its emphasis on discipline, moral seriousness, and the continuity of tradition, contributed to the ethical framework within which Jamie was raised. He grew up understanding that there were standards of behavior that transcended personal convenience or short-term gain, standards that applied in business as much as in personal life. The competitive fire. Even as a young boy, Jamie Dimon displayed the fierce competitive streak that would later become one of his most recognizable traits. Whether in school, in sports, in games with his brothers, or in the verbal jousting that characterized the Dimon dinner table, he played to win. This competitiveness was not the petulant, sore loser variety. It was something deeper and more sustained, a genuine internal drive to excel, to be the best, to understand more, work harder, and achieve more than anyone around him. His academic performance in his early schooling reflected this drive. Jamie was a strong student, not because learning came effortlessly to him, though he was certainly bright, but because he applied himself with an intensity that set him apart. He read voraciously, consuming books on a wide range of subjects. He was particularly drawn to mathematics and analytical subjects, areas that would serve him well in the financial world. But he was not a one-dimensional academic grind. He was social, outgoing, and charismatic, with a natural ability to connect with people that would prove as valuable as any technical skill. The competitive fire was also fed by the environment of New York City itself. Growing up in the shadow of Manhattan, that vertical monument to ambition, Jamie Dimon could not help but internalize the message that the city broadcast to anyone willing to listen. Aim high, work hard, and the world can be yours. New York City in the 1960s and early 1970s was a city of enormous contrasts, of staggering wealth and grinding poverty, of cultural brilliance and social upheaval, of boundless opportunity and crushing disappointment. For a bright, ambitious young man from a Greek-American family in Queens, it was the perfect incubator. The foundation is laid. By the time Jamie Dimon reached the end of his high school years, the essential architecture of his character was already in place. The family had given him everything he needed: intellectual curiosity from his father, emotional toughness from his mother, competitive drive from the chemistry of three brothers jockeying for position, a comfort with financial concepts that most people never develop in an entire lifetime, and a set of values rooted in the immigrant experience, values that prized hard work, education, loyalty, and integrity above all else. He had also developed something less tangible but equally important, a sense of destiny, a feeling that he was meant for something significant. This was not arrogance, or at least not only arrogance. It was the natural product of a household that believed in its children, that told them every day through word and deed that they were capable of great things, and that expected them to prove it. The Dimon family had traveled a remarkable distance in just 2 generations, from a Greek immigrant arriving with nothing to a middle-class family firmly established in the professional class of the world's greatest city. The trajectory pointed unmistakably upward, and Jamie Dimon was poised to extend it further than anyone in the family might have dared to imagine. The boy from Queens was about to step onto a larger stage. The values instilled by Panos Papadimitriou, reinforced by Ted and Themis Dimon, and sharpened by the competitive crucible of New York City, created something potent. A young man of extraordinary ambition, formidable intelligence, and unshakable confidence, ready to test himself against the world. Everything that followed, the education, the mentorship, the meteoric rise, and the devastating fall, had its roots here, in a household in Queens where a Greek-American family dared to dream big and raised a son who would dare to dream even bigger. Education at Tufts and Harvard Business School. The autumn of 1974 marked a turning point in the life of Jamie Dimon, not because anything dramatic happened, but because he stepped onto the campus of Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts, and began the slow, deliberate process of becoming someone different from who his family might have expected. He was 17 years old, the son of a successful stockbroker, the grandson of a Greek immigrant who had built a respectable career on Wall Street. The trajectory seemed obvious: study finance or business, return to New York, join the family trade. But Jamie Dimon, even as a teenager, possessed a restless intellectual curiosity that refused to be contained by the obvious path. He would study psychology. It was an unconventional choice for someone who would eventually become the most powerful banker in American history, but it revealed something essential about the young man's character. Dimon was not interested merely in the mechanics of money, the spreads, the yields, the ticker symbols that populated his father's world. He wanted to understand people, what motivated them, what frightened them, how they made decisions under pressure, and why those decisions so often turned out to be irrational. Psychology, to the young Dimon, was not a detour from the world of finance. It was a way of understanding the raw human material that made markets move. Tufts University in the mid-1970s was a school in transition, ascending from its reputation as a solid but unremarkable New England liberal arts college into something more ambitious. It sat on a hill overlooking Boston, close enough to Harvard and MIT to feel the gravitational pull of those institutions without being overshadowed by them. The campus had a scrappy, unpretentious energy that suited Dimon. He was not the kind of student who needed the imprimatur of an Ivy League name to feel validated. What he needed was space to think, to argue, to test himself against ideas that challenged him. And think he did. Dimon threw himself into his coursework with an intensity that impressed classmates and professors alike. He was not merely a good student, he was a voracious one, the kind who sat in the front row, asked pointed questions, and then stayed after class to continue the conversation. His study of psychology gave him a framework for understanding human behavior that would prove surprisingly useful in the decades to come, on trading floors, in boardrooms, in the delicate negotiations that define life at the top of corporate America. The discipline taught him to look beneath the surface of what people said and did, to identify the underlying fears and desires that drove their actions. It taught him that rationality was a thin veneer, easily cracked under stress, and that the best leaders were those who understood the emotional architecture of the people around them. But Dimon was not content with psychology alone. Alongside his studies of cognitive biases and behavioral patterns, he pursued a second major in economics. This was the more expected choice, the concession to practicality, and Dimon attacked it with equal fervor. The economics curriculum at Tufts in the mid-1970s was shaped by the intellectual turbulence of the era. The post-war Keynesian consensus was crumbling. Stagflation, that impossible combination of rising prices and economic stagnation, was confounding economists and policymakers alike. The oil crisis had shattered assumptions about American invulnerability. For a young student trying to make sense of how the world worked, it was a fascinating and unsettling time to study economics. Dimon absorbed the theoretical models and mathematical frameworks, but what interested him most was the gap between theory and reality. Academic economics, he sensed even then, had a tendency toward elegant abstraction that didn't always survive contact with the messy, unpredictable world of actual human behavior. This was where his dual training proved synergistic in ways he probably couldn't fully articulate at the time. Psychology told him that people were irrational, emotional, prone to herd behavior and panic. Economics told him that markets were supposed to be efficient, that prices reflected all available information, that rational actors would always optimize their outcomes. The tension between these two worldviews became a kind of intellectual engine for Dimon, driving him to seek out the places where conventional wisdom broke down and opportunities lurked. His years at Tufts were a period of personal maturation. Dimon had grown up in a comfortable Queens household, the product of a tight-knit Greek-American family where expectations were high and work ethic was not optional. At Tufts, he encountered a wider world, students from different backgrounds with different assumptions about what life owed them and what they owed in return. He was gregarious and competitive, the kind of person who could dominate a conversation without quite realizing he was doing it. Friends from that era recall a young man of enormous energy and occasional abrasiveness, someone who was always certain he was right and not always diplomatic about saying so. These qualities, the confidence, the bluntness, the impatience with mediocrity, were already fully formed by his college years. They would serve him well in some contexts and cause him enormous trouble in others. Dimon graduated from Tufts in 1978, summa cum laude, with his dual degrees in psychology and economics. He was 21 years old, armed with academic honors and a restless ambition that had not yet found its precise target. The question of what to do next loomed large. Many of his peers were heading directly to Wall Street, drawn by the magnetic pull of money and prestige that the financial industry exerted on the brightest graduates of America's elite universities. Others were continuing on to graduate school, pursuing PhDs or law degrees or MBAs. Dimon chose a middle path. He would work for a few years before deciding on the next step. He took a position at a management consulting firm, entering a profession that was then in the early stages of its explosive growth. The late 1970s were the dawn of consulting golden age, a period when firms like McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, and Bain were beginning to reshape the way American corporations thought about strategy, competition, and organizational structure. For a young man with Dimon's analytical gifts and appetite for problem-solving, consulting seemed like an ideal proving ground, a place where he could learn about a wide range of industries, work alongside smart people, and develop the kind of strategic thinking skills that would be valuable in whatever career he ultimately pursued. The reality, however, proved less satisfying than the promise. Dimon spent roughly 2 years in the consulting world, and while the experience was educational, it left him fundamentally unsatisfied. The issue was not intellectual, the work was challenging enough, and he was good at it. The issue was one of temperament and purpose. Consulting, by its nature, is an advisory business. Consultants analyze problems, develop recommendations, and present them to clients. But they don't do anything. They don't make the decisions. They don't live with the consequences. They don't build anything that endures. For someone of Dimon's disposition, his need for action, his desire to be at the center of events, his impatience with abstraction divorced from execution, this was a profound limitation. Years later, Dimon would speak about this period with a characteristic lack of sentimentality. He had learned useful things: how to analyze a business, how to structure a presentation, how to think systematically about competitive advantage, but he had also learned something more important about himself. He was not built for the sidelines. He wanted to be a principal, not an advisor. He wanted to make decisions, take risks, and see the direct results of his efforts. The consulting years, brief as they were, served as a kind of negative revelation, showing him what he didn't want to do with his life, and thereby clarifying what he did. By 1980, Dimon had made up his mind. He would go to business school. Specifically, he would go to Harvard Business School, the most prestigious graduate business program in the world, the institution that had minted generations of corporate leaders and Wall Street titans. It was an ambitious choice, but Dimon had the credentials to back it up: the summa cum laude degree from Tufts, the consulting experience, the crackling intelligence that was evident to anyone who spent 5 minutes in conversation with him. He applied, was accepted, and in the fall of 1980, he made the short journey from wherever his consulting work had taken him to the manicured campus that sits along the Charles River in Boston. Harvard Business School in 1980 was a very particular kind of place. It occupied a sprawling campus on the south bank of the Charles, separated from the main university by the river and by a certain philosophical distance as well. While Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences prided itself on theoretical rigor and scholarly detachment, the business school was unabashedly practical, devoted to the proposition that management was a profession that could be taught, and that the case study method was the best way to teach it. Every day, students filed into tiered amphitheater-style classrooms, confronted with thick packets describing real business problems faced by real companies. They were expected to have read and analyzed the case before class, and then to participate, vigorously, competitively, sometimes combatively, in a discussion that could last 90 minutes or more. Grades were based significantly on class participation, which meant that simply being smart was not enough. You had to be articulate, persuasive, and fast on your feet. You had to be willing to stake out a position and defend it against dozens of equally smart and ambitious peers. It was, in short, an environment perfectly designed for Jamie Dimon. He thrived from the very first day. The case method suited his combative intellectual style, his love of argument, his ability to cut through complexity and identify the essential issue. Classmates remember him as one of the dominant voices in section discussions, not the loudest necessarily, but among the most incisive. He had a gift for synthesis, for taking the scattered threads of a case discussion and weaving them into a coherent narrative that made everyone else feel like they'd been missing the point. He could be impatient with classmates he considered slow or sloppy in their thinking, a trait that earned him both admirers and detractors. But even those who found him abrasive conceded that he was usually right, or at least more right than anyone else in the room. The Harvard MBA class of 1982 was a remarkable cohort, even by the school's elevated standards. These were young men and women who had come of age during the economic turmoil of the 1970s and who now stood on the threshold of a new era. Ronald Reagan had just been elected president, promising to unleash the power of free markets and deregulation. The financial industry was about to be transformed by a wave of innovation: junk bonds, leveraged buyouts, derivatives, the securitization of everything. The students who arrived at Harvard Business School in 1980 could sense that something was shifting in the tectonic plates of American capitalism, even if they couldn't yet see the full picture. Many of them would go on to play central roles in that transformation. Dimon distinguished himself not only in the classroom, but also in the less formal arenas where business school reputations are forged: study groups, social gatherings, the late-night conversations in dormitory common rooms where ambitious young people tested their ideas against one another and began to form the networks that would sustain their careers for decades. He was drawn to people who were serious about business, who shared his intensity and his sense that the stakes of what they were learning were real. He had little patience for the social climbers and resume polishers who treated Harvard Business School as a credentialing exercise rather than an intellectual crucible. His academic performance was outstanding. Dimon was named a Baker Scholar, an honor reserved for the top 5% of the graduating class. It was the highest academic distinction Harvard Business School bestowed, and it placed him in the company of a small, elite group of students who had demonstrated not just intelligence, but a sustained capacity for analytical brilliance across every dimension of the curriculum: finance, marketing, operations, organizational behavior, strategy. For Dimon, the Baker Scholar designation was more than a line on a resume. It was confirmation of something he had always suspected about himself: that he could compete with anyone, anywhere, at the highest level. But the most consequential thing that happened to Jamie Dimon at Harvard Business School had nothing to do with case studies or grades or academic honors. It happened because of a connection that ran through his own family, a thread that reached back to his father's world on Wall Street and forward into a future that neither father nor son could have imagined. Sandy Weill, the restless, combative dealmaker who had built Shearson into one of Wall Street's most formidable firms before selling it to American Express, was a figure Jamie had heard about since childhood. The Dimon family's connection to Weill was not merely professional, but personal. Ted Dimon had worked under Weill at Shearson, and the two men shared a mutual respect rooted in the old-school culture of the brokerage business, where relationships mattered as much as numbers, and a handshake still carried weight. Jamie had grown up hearing Weill's name spoken with a kind of reverence around the dinner table, understanding even as a teenager that this was a man who operated on a different plane from most of the executives his father knew. He was a builder, a consolidator, someone who saw the financial industry not as a collection of static institutions, but as a landscape ripe for transformation. When Dimon learned during his second year at Harvard Business School that Sandy was visiting campus, or in some tellings of the story, when he simply reached out to Weill through his father's introduction, the encounter that followed would alter the trajectory of his life more profoundly than any case study or classroom debate ever could. But to understand why that meeting mattered so much, one has to understand what Dimon had become by the time it occurred. The young man who sat down with Sandy Weill was not the same person who had arrived at Tufts University 6 years earlier, bright and ambitious, but still unformed. He was not even the same person who had walked through the doors of Harvard Business School 2 years before, confident in his abilities, but still searching for the specific vessel into which he would pour his energies. By the spring of 1982, Jamie Dimon was something more complete. A young man who had been shaped by two very different educational experiences into someone with both the intellectual firepower and the temperamental intensity to operate at the highest levels of American finance. The transformation had been gradual, built layer upon layer across those formative years. At Tufts, he had discovered the pleasures of intellectual breadth, of allowing his mind to range across disciplines and find unexpected connections. The liberal arts education had given him something that many of his Harvard Business School classmates lacked: a sense of context, a feeling for the human dimensions of economic life that went beyond spreadsheets and financial models. He had read history and philosophy alongside his economics and accounting courses. He had engaged with ideas about politics, culture, and society that would later inform his understanding of the broader environment in which financial institutions operated. He had learned, in ways that would only become apparent much later, that the ability to think about the world in its full complexity was not a luxury for a business leader, but a necessity. Harvard had then taken those raw materials and subjected them to an extraordinary process of refinement. The case method had taught him to think on his feet, to marshal evidence quickly, to defend a position under fire and abandon it without ego when the evidence demanded it. The competitive atmosphere had shown him that he could hold his own against the brightest minds of his generation, and not just hold his own, but excel. The Baker's Scholar distinction was the formal acknowledgement, but the real education had been subtler, a deepening of his instinct for what mattered in a business situation, an ability to cut through complexity to the essential truth of a problem, and a growing confidence that his judgment, honed by years of argument and analysis, was something he could trust. The rigor of Harvard's finance curriculum, in particular, had given Dimon a technical foundation that would prove indispensable. He had studied under professors who were helping to invent modern financial theory, the efficient market hypothesis, the capital asset pricing model, the Black-Scholes options pricing formula. These were ideas that were reshaping Wall Street in real time, and Dimon absorbed them with the veracity of someone who understood that theoretical knowledge was not opposed to practical application, but was, in fact, its deepest source. He could read a balance sheet with the fluency of a native speaker, but he could also step back and see the strategic picture, where an institution was positioned in its competitive landscape, what forces were acting on it, where the opportunities for value creation lay. This combination of granular financial literacy and broad strategic vision would become one of his defining characteristics as an executive, and its roots lay firmly in those years of study. Yet, for all the intellectual growth, it was perhaps the social and psychological dimensions of his education that mattered most. Dimon had arrived at college as the product of a particular milieu, the upper-middle-class Greek-American world of New York, where family loyalty was paramount and professional ambition was channeled through well-established networks. Tufts had expanded his horizons, introducing him to people from different backgrounds and different ways of thinking. Harvard had expanded them further, placing him in a pressure cooker of ambition, where the only thing that mattered was the quality of your mind and the force of your personality. He had learned to navigate complex social dynamics, to build alliances and manage rivalries, to project authority in rooms full of people who were equally convinced of their own brilliance. These were skills that no textbook could teach, and they were skills that would prove every bit as important as financial acumen in the decades to come. The Harvard Business School experience also crystallized something in Dimon's character that had been present since childhood, but had never been fully articulated: a deep, almost moral conviction about the importance of getting things right. He was not content with approximate answers or good enough solutions. He wanted to understand problems completely, to follow the logic wherever it led, and to arrive at conclusions that could withstand the most rigorous scrutiny. This perfectionism could shade into stubbornness, a refusal to compromise that would later create friction with colleagues and superiors, but it also gave him a credibility and authority that few of his contemporaries could match. When Jamie Dimon said something was true, people believed him because they knew he had done the work. His classmates from those years would later recall him with a mixture of warmth and wariness. He was generous with his time and his insights, always willing to help a study group member work through a difficult problem or to stay up late debating the merits of a particular strategy. But he could also be cutting, even cruel, when confronted with what he perceived as laziness or intellectual dishonesty. He had inherited from his father and grandfather a belief that the business of business was serious, that real money, real jobs, real lives were at stake, and he had little tolerance for people who treated it as a game. This intensity could be exhausting, and not everyone wanted to be around it. But those who did, those who could match his energy and his commitment, found in Dimon a friend and ally of fierce loyalty. It is worth pausing to consider what Jamie Dimon did not do during these years, because the path not taken is often as revealing as the one chosen. He did not, as many of his Harvard classmates did, spend his summers and his networking energy pursuing positions at the most prestigious investment banks or consulting firms. He did not chase the conventional trophies that the Harvard Business School machine was designed to produce: the Goldman Sachs offer, the McKinsey partnership track, the private equity fast lane. He was aware of these options, certainly, and he had the credentials to pursue any of them, but something in him resisted the gravitational pull of the obvious path. He wanted something different, something that would allow him to build rather than merely advise, to exercise real authority rather than to serve as a highly paid consultant to people who held the actual power. This impulse, the desire to be a principal rather than an agent, a decision-maker rather than a counselor, was perhaps the most important thing Dimon took away from his years of education. It was a conviction that had been forming since those childhood dinners where he listened to his father and grandfather discuss the day's trades, since those afternoons at Browning when he first began to understand that the world of finance was not an abstraction, but a living, breathing thing that responded to human intelligence and human will. Tufts had given him the intellectual foundation, Harvard had given him the technical skills and the competitive confidence, but the fundamental orientation, the burning desire to be in the arena, to make the calls that mattered, to bear the consequences of his own judgment, was something that had been hardwired into him long before he set foot in any classroom. As the spring of 1982 approached and the class of '82 began to scatter toward their various futures, Dimon stood at a crossroads that was, in many ways, more consequential than any he had faced before. He had the grades, the honors, the network, and the pedigree to write his own ticket anywhere in the financial world. The question was not what he could do, but what he would choose to do, and with whom. The answer to that question, when it came, would be shaped by everything he had learned and everything he had become during those 6 transformative years, from the leafy hillside campus in Medford to the austere brick buildings along the Charles River. It would be shaped by the intellectual rigor he had cultivated, by the competitive fire that burned in him, by the moral seriousness with which he approached the business of finance, and by an ambition that was not merely personal but almost visionary in its scope. The education of Jamie Dimon was, in the end, something more than the sum of its institutional parts. Tufts and Harvard had each given him essential tools, but the real education had been internal, a process of self-discovery that had revealed to him the full dimensions of his own talent and the specific form that his ambition would take. He had entered college as a smart kid from a good family with a vague sense that he was destined for something significant. He left graduate school as a fully formed intellect with a precise understanding of his own capabilities and a hunger to test them against the real world. The theoretical phase of his education was over. What came next would be entirely practical, entirely consequential, and entirely dependent on a partnership that was about to be forged between a 26-year-old Baker scholar and a restless titan who was plotting his return to the summit of American finance. In the spring of 1982, as Harvard Business School's graduating class prepared to scatter across the commanding heights of American finance, Jamie Dimon held in his hands what most of his classmates would have considered an embarrassment of riches. Goldman Sachs wanted him, Morgan Stanley wanted him, Lehman Brothers wanted him. These were the names that adorned the dreams of virtually every ambitious young person who had ever cracked open a finance textbook. The white shoe firms, the bulge bracket, the institutions that conferred upon their junior employees an instant and unmistakable pedigree. To receive an offer from even one of them was a validation. To hold offers from all 3 simultaneously was something approaching a coronation, and Jamie Dimon turned them all down. The decision baffled his classmates. It puzzled some of his professors. It likely gave his father, Theodore Dimon, himself a man who understood the gravitational pull of prestige on Wall Street, at least a moment's pause, even if he understood the reasoning better than most. Because the job Jamie Dimon chose instead carried none of the glittering institutional cachet of a Goldman Sachs or a Morgan Stanley. He chose to go work as a personal assistant to a man named Sanford I. Weill, who at that precise moment in the spring of 1982 was, by the conventional scorekeeping of Wall Street, something very close to a has-been. To understand the magnitude of this choice and the almost uncanny instinct it revealed in the 26-year-old Dimon, one must first understand who Sandy Weill was, where he had been, and the peculiar limbo in which he found himself at the moment their paths converged. Sanford Weill's story, up to the point where Dimon entered it, read like a parable about the fragility of power in American finance. Born in 1933 in Brooklyn, the son of a dressmaker from Poland and a homemaker, Weill had clawed his way into the securities business with none of the Ivy League credentials or family connections that typically greased the path. He had attended Cornell, not Harvard or Yale. He had started not at a prestigious firm, but at Bear Stearns, working as a runner, the lowest of the low, before co-founding his own small brokerage, Carter, Burland, Patoma, and Weill in 1960. Through the 1960s and 1970s, Weill had demonstrated an almost preternatural gift for acquiring struggling or undervalued financial firms, stripping out their inefficiencies, cutting costs with a butcher's precision, and integrating them into an ever-expanding empire. One by one, the names fell into his orbit:
Carter, Burland, and Weill became CBWL Haydenstone, which became Haydenstone, which became Shearson Haydenstone, which became Shearson Loeb Rhodes, which eventually became Shearson American Express after Weill orchestrated the sale of Shearson to American Express in 1981. It was a dazzling trajectory. By the late 1970s, Sandy Weill had built Shearson into the second largest brokerage firm in the United States, a sprawling enterprise with thousands of brokers and offices across the country. He was the consummate dealmaker, the quintessential acquirer, a man who seemed to understand intuitively that in the financial services industry, scale was not merely an advantage, but a kind of destiny. He had done it all without the establishment's blessing, and in some ways in defiance of it. The old-line Wall Street firms had long regarded Weill with a mixture of condescension and unease. Condescension because of his outer borough origins and his firm's roots in retail brokerage, considered a distinctly unglamorous corner of the business, and unease because his relentless acquisition strategy kept working, kept producing results, kept proving that the patrician assumptions about how a financial empire ought to be built were not the only assumptions available. The sale to American Express in 1981 was supposed to be the capstone. Weill traded Shearson, his creation, his identity, for a position as president of American Express, one of the most storied names in American corporate life. The logic seemed impeccable. He would bring his deal-making acumen and his cost-cutting ferocity to a blue-chip company, and American Express would give him the platform and the respectability that had always eluded him. He would finally be an insider. But Wall Street's establishment has a way of consuming outsiders rather than accepting them, and what happened to Weill inside American Express became one of the most instructive cautionary tales of the 1980s corporate landscape. Almost immediately, Weill found himself in a political environment for which his skills were poorly suited.
American Express's chairman and CEO, James Robinson III, was everything Weill was not. Patrician, smooth, a product of the Georgia aristocracy and the Harvard Business School, a man who moved through the social circuits of Manhattan's elite with the easy grace of someone who had never had to fight for a seat at the table. Robinson had his own vision for American Express, and it did not necessarily include sharing power with the aggressive, rough-edged empire builder from Brooklyn. Weill was given a title, an office, and increasingly little to do. The political maneuvering within American Express's executive suite was subtle and relentless, and Weill, whose genius ran to balance sheets and acquisition targets rather than boardroom intrigue, found himself outflanked. His authority was quietly circumscribed. His proposals were politely shelved. His allies within the organization were reassigned or marginalized. By the spring of 1982, Sandy Weill, the man who had built Shearson from nothing, who had orchestrated dozens of acquisitions, who had stood atop the second largest brokerage house in America, was languishing in a kind of gilded exile within American Express, holding the title of president, but commanding less real power with each passing month. It was into this precise situation that Jamie Dimon chose to walk. The connection between the two men had its roots in a web of personal relationships that stretched back well before Dimon's time at Harvard Business School. The crucial link was Dimon's father, Theodore, who had spent years working in the securities industry as a senior executive at various brokerage firms. Theodore Dimon had known Sandy Weill professionally for years. The two men moved in overlapping circles within the world of retail brokerage, and they had developed a genuine personal friendship. When Sandy Weill needed advice or a sounding board, Ted Dimon was one of the people he called. When the Dimon family discussed the world of finance around their dinner table in Queens, as they apparently did with great frequency and relish, Sandy Weill's name came up as a figure of admiration, a man who had built something real and formidable in a business that often rewarded pedigree over performance. Jamie had met Weill socially through his father when he was still a teenager, and the encounters had left an impression. But the relationship that would reshape both their lives began to crystallize during the summer between Dimon's first and second years at Harvard Business School. In the summer of 1981, Dimon worked at Goldman Sachs, a plum assignment by any standard, but he also stayed in contact with Weill, who was then in the process of completing the American Express transaction. The two spoke on the phone. They discussed business, strategy, the art of building financial enterprises. For Weill, still in his late 40s and at the height of his powers, these conversations with his friend Ted's son were likely pleasant but not particularly consequential. For Dimon, they were revelatory. What Dimon saw in Sandy Weill was something his classmates at Harvard Business School, scanning their neatly ranked lists of prestigious employers, could not easily see. He saw a man whose approach to building a financial business aligned perfectly with Dimon's own emerging instincts. Weill was not a trader. He was not a deal-structuring wizard in the mold of the era's emerging leveraged buyout artists. He was, at his core, an operator, someone who understood that the real money in financial services was made not through individual brilliant transactions, but through the patient, unglamorous work of acquiring businesses, integrating them, cutting costs, improving operations, and extracting value from the combined enterprise. It was a strategy that required an unusual combination of strategic vision and granular attention to detail, and it was a strategy that resonated deeply with Dimon's own cast of mind. Dimon had grown up watching his father navigate the complexities of the brokerage business. He had listened to dinner table conversations about profit margins, operational efficiency, and the difference between firms that merely survived and firms that thrived. He had inherited, or perhaps absorbed through long osmosis, a fundamental belief that financial businesses were, at bottom, businesses, and that the principles of sound management applied to them just as surely as they applied to manufacturers or retailers. This was not, in 1982, the prevailing attitude at the elite firms that were courting him. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and Lehman Brothers were in the business of making markets, advising on mergers, underwriting securities. They were transaction machines, and their young recruits were expected to be transaction artists. The culture was one of brilliant individual performance, not operational excellence. Sandy Weill offered something different. He offered a chance to learn the business of building a business, not from the vantage point of an analyst buried in a bullpen running numbers on someone else's deal, but from the side of a man who had actually done it, who had taken a nothing firm and turned it into a colossus, and who was now, even in his diminished state at American Express, clearly plotting his next move. During Dimon's second year at Harvard, as he weighed his options with increasing seriousness, he wrote to Weill expressing his interest in working for him. The letter has become one of the most discussed artifacts of modern Wall Street lore, not because it was particularly eloquent or prophetic, but because of what it represented. A young man of extraordinary talent and options making a deliberate, calculated bet on a specific person rather than a specific institution. The conventional wisdom of the early 1980s, and indeed the conventional wisdom that has prevailed on Wall Street for most of its history, held that the smart move for a freshly minted MBA was to affiliate with the most prestigious brand available. The logic was straightforward. A Goldman Sachs or a Morgan Stanley stamped you with a mark of quality that opened doors for the rest of your career. Even if you only stayed for a few years, the brand traveled with you. The institution was the thing. Dimon's letter to Weill was a repudiation of this logic. He was not choosing an institution, he was choosing a man. He was choosing a specific mind, a specific approach to business, a specific set of skills that he wanted to learn. And he was doing so at a moment when the man in question was widely perceived to be on the wrong side of history, sidelined, diminished, possibly finished as a major force in American finance. Weill, by several accounts, was both flattered and intrigued. Here was his old friend Ted Dimon's kid, a Baker scholar from Harvard Business School, one of the top graduates in his class, who was voluntarily passing up the most coveted jobs in finance to come work for him. It was, if nothing else, a hell of a vote of confidence at a time when confidence was in short supply, and Weill was shrewd enough to recognize talent when it presented itself. He had built Shearson in large part by surrounding himself with capable, driven people, and this young man clearly fit the profile. But there was also a practical consideration that made the arrangement attractive to Weill. At American Express, he was engaged in a daily struggle for relevance and influence. He needed allies. He needed people around him who were unquestionably loyal, who owed their position to him and not to the American Express hierarchy, who would work with the same ferocity and focus that he brought to every undertaking. A brilliant young MBA who had chosen him personally, not American Express, not the Shearson division, but Sandy Weill the man, was exactly the kind of ally he needed. And so the arrangement was struck. In the summer of 1982, Jamie Dimon reported for duty at American Express as an assistant to Sandy Weill. His title was modest, his salary was unremarkable. His classmates from Harvard were settling into their analyst programs at Goldman and Morgan Stanley and the other prestigious houses, beginning the well-worn ascent through the hierarchy that would, in the normal course of events, lead to vice presidencies, directorships, and eventually partnerships. Dimon, by contrast, was fetching Sandy Weill's morning coffee, sitting outside his office, and learning the financial services business from the ground up in a way that no analyst program at any bulge bracket firm could have provided. The early days of the Dimon-Weill partnership were, by all accounts, a period of extraordinary intensity and intimacy. Weill was not a delegator by nature. He was a hands-on executive who wanted to know everything, every number, every deal, every operational detail of whatever business he was running. He had always worked closely with a small circle of trusted lieutenants, and Dimon quickly became the innermost member of that circle. The two men spent their days together in a way that was unusual even by the standards of famously demanding work culture. Dimon was not simply assisting Weill, he was shadowing him, absorbing his thinking, learning to see the financial services landscape through Weill's particular lens. What Weill taught, or rather what Dimon learned by observing Weill in action, was a comprehensive philosophy of financial services management that would shape Dimon's approach for the rest of his career. It started with numbers. Sandy Weill was, above all else, a numbers man. He believed that the truth of any business was contained in its financials, and he had an uncanny ability to drill through layers of corporate complexity to find the essential metrics that determined whether an enterprise was healthy or sick, improving or deteriorating, well managed or poorly managed. He read financial statements the way a musician reads a score, fluently, intuitively, hearing patterns and dissonances that others missed. Dimon, who had always been mathematically gifted and analytically inclined, took to this approach with remarkable natural aptitude. The two men would sit together for hours, poring over spreadsheets and financial reports, debating the significance of this ratio or that trend line, arguing about what the numbers revealed and what they concealed. It was a kind of apprenticeship that bore more resemblance to the master-apprentice relationships of the medieval guilds than to anything on offer at a modern business school. Weill was teaching Dimon not just what to look for, but how to look, how to approach a financial enterprise with the disciplined, skeptical, detail-oriented mindset that separated truly great managers from merely competent ones. But the education went far beyond number crunching. Weill also embodied a particular approach to corporate strategy that was, in the context of the early 1980s, somewhat unfashionable but immensely powerful. He believed in growth through acquisition, but not the kind of heedless, empire-building acquisition that would characterize so many of the era's corporate disasters. Weill's acquisition philosophy was grounded in a rigorous cost-benefit analysis. He looked for companies that were undervalued or underperforming, acquired them at reasonable prices, and then went to work with almost surgical precision on the task of integration, eliminating redundant operations, cutting unnecessary costs, rationalizing management structures, and extracting what he called synergies from the combined enterprise. It was not glamorous work. It did not generate the kind of headlines that a hostile takeover or a billion-dollar leveraged buyout produced. But it built real, sustainable value, and Weill had proved it over and over again throughout his career. Dimon absorbed this philosophy completely. The idea that you could create enormous value not by inventing new financial products or executing brilliant trades, but by the patient, methodical work of buying, integrating, and operating financial businesses. This became a foundational principle of his own approach to management. It was a principle he would carry with him through every subsequent chapter of his career, from the smallest acquisitions to the largest, from the rebuilding of struggling enterprises to the management of what would eventually become the largest bank in the United States. There was also a personal dimension to the relationship that deepened rapidly during these early months. Sandy Weill and Jamie Dimon were in many ways an unlikely pair. Weill was nearly 20 years older, a product of the old retail brokerage world, gruff and sometimes temperamental, with a management style that could veer from generous warmth to volcanic anger in the space of a single conversation. Dimon was young, polished, at least by comparison, analytically precise, and blessed with a directness that could shade into bluntness. Where Weill operated largely on instinct honed by decades of experience, Dimon brought a more systematic, data-driven approach. Where Weill sometimes let personal relationships and emotional attachments cloud his judgment about people and deals, Dimon was developing a reputation for cold-eyed pragmatism that occasionally unnerved those around him. And yet, the chemistry between them was electric. They complemented each other in ways that both men seemed to recognize almost immediately. Weill provided the vision, the relationships, the decades of accumulated wisdom about how financial institutions actually worked in practice, as opposed to how they worked in the case studies of Harvard Business School. Dimon provided the analytical rigor, the tireless work ethic, the willingness to dig into the most tedious operational details, and perhaps most importantly, a fierce, almost protective loyalty to Weill and his agenda. The relationship quickly took on a quality that observers would later describe using a variety of metaphors, each capturing a different facet of its unusual nature. It was, people said, like a father-son relationship, except that Dimon already had a father he loved and admired, and Weill already had children of his own. It was like a mentor-protege relationship, except that the protege's contributions quickly became so substantial that the term assistant began to seem absurd. It was, perhaps most accurately, a partnership between two intensely driven, extraordinarily gifted men who recognized in each other a mirror of their own ambitions and a complement to their own limitations. What made the partnership particularly potent was the absolute trust that characterized its early years. Weill trusted Dimon completely, with information, with access, with the kind of unfiltered candor that powerful men rarely extend to anyone, let alone to a 26-year-old fresh out of business school. And Dimon repaid that trust with a devotion that went well beyond professional obligation. He worked staggering hours. He made Weill's problems his own. He threw himself into whatever task was at hand, whether it was analyzing an acquisition target, preparing a presentation for the board, or managing the logistics of Weill's increasingly complex professional life, with an intensity that quickly set him apart from everyone else in Weill's orbit. This intensity was not always comfortable for those around them. From the very beginning, there were people within Weill's circle who viewed the young Dimon with suspicion and resentment. He had arrived with no track record, no demonstrated accomplishments in the world of finance, nothing but a Harvard degree and a personal connection to the boss. And yet, he was immediately granted a level of access and influence that others had spent years earning. The fact that he was brilliant and hardworking did not entirely mitigate the perception that he was, in some sense, a princeling, elevated by favoritism rather than merit. Dimon seemed largely unbothered by these undercurrents of resentment, or at least unwilling to modify his behavior in response to them. He had not come to American Express to make friends, or to navigate a corporate hierarchy with diplomatic finesse. He had come to learn from Sandy Weill, and he pursued that education with a single-mindedness that left little room for the social niceties of organizational life. If people were threatened by his closeness to Weill, that was their problem. If they resented his rapid rise, they could take it up with the boss. Dimon's focus was on the work, and the work was all-consuming. It was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout his career. The brilliant young executive whose talent and drive were undeniable, but whose interpersonal style generated friction, whose impatience with mediocrity and politics alienated potential allies, whose loyalty to the mission and to the man at the top sometimes came at the expense of relationships with everyone else. But in these earliest days, when the partnership was new and the mutual admiration was at its peak, the friction was manageable, a minor irritant against the backdrop of what both men clearly sensed was the beginning of something extraordinary. The chemistry between Weill and Dimon was, at its core, rooted in a shared language, the language of numbers, of deals, of relentless forward motion. Both men possessed what might be called an operational imagination, the ability to look at a business, any business, and see not just what it was, but what it could become if the right levers were pulled, the right costs eliminated, the right opportunities seized. For Weill, this had always been instinctive, a gift honed over decades of buying, restructuring, and building financial companies from the ground up. For Dimon, it was something newer, still crystallizing, but no less potent. He could read a balance sheet the way a musician reads a score, hearing not just the individual notes, but the harmonics, the dissonances, the places where the melody was about to break down. Together, they could dissect a company's financials with a speed and precision that left others in the room struggling to keep up. What Dimon learned from Weill in those early months and years was not the kind of knowledge that could be acquired in a classroom or from a textbook. It was the accumulated wisdom of a man who had spent his entire adult life in the trenches of Wall Street, a man who had built Shearson from a tiny brokerage into a powerhouse, who had merged and acquired and restructured his way to the top of the financial world, and who had lost it all, or very nearly, when American Express had pushed him aside. Weill knew things that no professor could teach: how to read the mood of a boardroom, how to sense when a deal was about to slip away, how to apply pressure without appearing to apply pressure, how to make an adversary feel like a partner while negotiating terms that were anything but generous. Dimon's focus was on the work, and the work was all-consuming. It was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout his career. The brilliant young executive whose talent and drive were undeniable, but whose interpersonal style generated friction, whose impatience with mediocrity and politics alienated potential allies, whose loyalty to the mission and to the man at the top sometimes came at the expense of relationships with everyone else. But in these earliest days, when the partnership was new and the mutual admiration was at its peak, the friction was manageable, a minor irritant against the backdrop of what both men clearly sensed was the beginning of something extraordinary. The chemistry between Weill and Dimon was, at its core, rooted in a shared language, the language of numbers, of deals, of relentless forward motion. Both men possessed what might be called an operational imagination, the ability to look at a business, any business, and see not just what it was, but what it could become if the right levers were pulled, the right costs eliminated, the right opportunities seized. For Weill, this had always been instinctive, a gift honed over decades of buying, restructuring, and building financial companies from the ground up. For Dimon, it was something newer, still crystallizing, but no less potent. He could read a balance sheet the way a musician reads a score, hearing not just the individual notes, but the harmonics, the dissonances, the places where the melody was about to break down. Together, they could dissect a company's financials with a speed and precision that left others in the room struggling to keep up. What Dimon learned from Weill in those early months and years was not the kind of knowledge that could be acquired in a classroom or from a textbook. It was the accumulated wisdom of a man who had spent his entire adult life in the trenches of Wall Street, a man who had built Shearson from a tiny brokerage into a powerhouse, who had merged and acquired and restructured his way to the top of the financial world, and who had lost it all, or very nearly, when American Express had pushed him aside. Weill knew things that no professor could teach:
how to read the mood of a boardroom, how to sense when a deal was about to slip away, how to apply pressure without appearing to apply pressure, how to make an adversary feel like a partner while negotiating terms that were anything but generous. Dimon's focus was on the work, and the work was all-consuming.
He studied the way Weill prepared for negotiations, the meticulous homework that preceded every encounter, the way he walked into a room already knowing more about the other side's position than they might have expected. He observed the way Weill managed relationships with bankers, lawyers, board members, and regulators, the careful calibration of warmth and authority, the memory for personal details that made people feel valued even as they were being outmaneuvered. These were lessons that could not be taught in a lecture hall, and Dimon recognized their value with a clarity that few people his age would have possessed. But the education was not one-directional. If Weill was teaching Dimon the art of deal-making and corporate strategy, Dimon was bringing something equally valuable to the table, a rigor, a discipline, an analytical precision that complemented Weill's more intuitive approach. Weill was a gut instinct operator, a man who trusted his feel for a situation as much as he trusted the numbers. Dimon was, by temperament and training, a numbers man, someone who wanted to see the data, run the models, stress test the assumptions before committing to a course of action. The combination was extraordinarily powerful. Weill's intuition would identify the opportunity. Dimon's analysis would confirm it, refine it, and map out the path to execution. Or, just as importantly, Dimon's analysis would reveal the flaws in what seemed like a promising idea, saving them from a mistake before it was made. It was a dynamic that would define their partnership for over a decade and produce some of the most consequential deals in the history of American finance. There was also the matter of work ethic, which in both men bordered on the pathological. Weill had always been a relentless worker, the kind of executive who arrived early, stayed late, and expected everyone around him to do the same. But in Dimon, he had found someone who could match him hour for hour, intensity for intensity. The young man seemed to have no off switch. He would work through weekends without complaint, stay up until the early hours of the morning poring over financial statements, and show up the next day ready for more. This was not mere ambition or careerism, though both certainly played a role. It was something deeper, a genuine love for the work itself, a fascination with the mechanics of business that made the long hours feel less like a sacrifice than a privilege. Dimon simply could not get enough. Every deal, every meeting, every financial analysis was another piece of the puzzle, another lesson in the vast and endlessly complex world of finance. And the fact that he was learning from one of the masters of that world made the experience all the more intoxicating. The nature of Dimon's role in those early days defied easy categorization. His title was modest. He was, officially, an assistant to the president. But his responsibilities quickly expanded far beyond what that title suggested. He was Weill's sounding board, his analytical engine, his confidential advisor, his representative in meetings where Weill could not be present, and, increasingly, his operational right hand. When Weill needed a presentation prepared for the board, Dimon prepared it. When Weill needed a potential acquisition analyzed, Dimon did the analysis. When Weill needed someone to sit in on a meeting and report back on what had happened, what had been said, and what it meant, Dimon was the one who went. He was everywhere, involved in everything, and his fingerprints were on virtually every significant decision that came out of Weill's office. This omnipotence was a reflection of something fundamental about the way Weill operated. Unlike many corporate chieftains who surrounded themselves with layers of bureaucracy and delegated decision-making to trusted lieutenants, Weill wanted to be involved in everything himself. He was a control-oriented leader who believed that the details mattered, that the devil was always lurking in the footnotes, and that the only way to truly understand a business was to get your hands dirty. Dimon became the instrument of that philosophy, the person who could extend Weill's reach, who could be in the places Weill couldn't be, who could gather the information Weill needed and present it in a form that was both comprehensive and concise. In a sense, Dimon became Weill's second pair of eyes, his second set of hands, an extension of Weill's own formidable will. The trust that this arrangement required was enormous, And it was a trust that Weill extended to Dimon almost immediately. There were things that Weill shared with Dimon that he shared with almost no one else. This level of confidence was remarkable given Dimon's youth and inexperience, and it spoke to something that went beyond mere professional respect. Weill saw in Dimon a version of his younger self, hungry, brilliant, fearless, utterly committed to winning. More than that, he saw someone he could trust, and in the sometimes treacherous world of corporate politics, trust was the rarest and most valuable commodity of all. For Dimon's part, the trust was reciprocated fully. He gave himself over to the relationship with a completeness that was both its greatest strength and, ultimately, its greatest vulnerability. He did not hedge his bets, did not cultivate alternative relationships or power bases, did not maintain the kind of strategic distance that might have protected him if the relationship ever soured. He went all in on Sandy Weill, betting his career and his future on the belief that this partnership would carry them both to the top of the financial world. It was a gamble that would pay off spectacularly for many years, and then, in a single devastating moment, it would not. But that reckoning lay far in the future. In the early days, the partnership was defined by its extraordinary productivity and by the almost electric sense of shared purpose that animated both men. They were, in those years, building something together. Not yet a company, not yet an empire, but a way of working, a methodology, a shared approach to the business of finance that would later become the foundation of everything they accomplished. They were learning each other's rhythms, developing the kind of shorthand that only comes from spending hundreds and thousands of hours in close collaboration. A look, a gesture, a half-finished sentence, these became sufficient to communicate complex ideas and decisions between them. They could finish each other's thoughts, anticipate each other's objections, and arrive at conclusions together with a speed that amazed and sometimes unnerved the people around them. The bond was strengthened by the circumstances of its formation. When Dimon joined Weill at American Express, Weill was in a difficult position, a powerful man who had been stripped of much of his power, a builder who had been told he could no longer build. The corporate environment was hostile, the politics were treacherous, and the future was uncertain. In that context, Dimon's arrival was not just a professional convenience, but a personal lifeline. Here was someone who believed in Weill unreservedly, who was willing to work tirelessly on his behalf, who brought fresh energy and formidable talent to a situation that badly needed both. Weill, who had always inspired intense loyalty in his closest associates, inspired in Dimon a devotion that was absolute. The depth of this devotion was evident in the way Dimon organized his life around Weill's needs and schedule. He was available at all hours, ready to drop whatever he was doing to respond to a call or a request. He traveled when Weill needed him to travel. He canceled personal plans when work demanded it. He subordinated his own preferences and priorities to the demands of the partnership with a consistency that, in hindsight, was almost monastic. His wife, Judy, whom he had married after graduating from Harvard Business School, the same Judy Kent whose family connection to Weill had helped set the whole partnership in motion, understood the nature of this commitment and accepted it, though it could not have been easy. The boundaries between Dimon's professional and personal lives were, from the very beginning, porous to the point of non-existence. This was partly a function of the family connections that linked the two men. The Dimon and Weill families were not merely professionally connected, but personally intertwined. Social gatherings, holidays, family events, these all brought the two households together in ways that blurred the line between work and life. Weill and his wife, Joan, were not just Jamie's boss and his boss's wife, they were, in a sense, extended family. This closeness added a warmth and richness to the professional relationship that was genuine and deeply felt by both sides, but it also raised the stakes enormously. When the relationship eventually fractured, the break would not be merely professional, it would be personal, familial, a rupture that would send shockwaves through both families and leave wounds that would take years, if not a lifetime, to heal. Yet the intimacy of the connection also gave the partnership a depth and resilience that more conventional professional relationships lacked. Weill and Dimon did not merely work together, they lived in each other's worlds. They knew each other's families, understood each other's motivations, shared a frame of reference that went beyond spreadsheets and deal structures.
This made their collaboration richer and more productive because it was grounded not just in mutual respect, but in genuine affection, the kind of affection that allows for blunt honesty, for passionate disagreement, for the kind of creative friction that produces breakthrough thinking.
In the best moments of their partnership, Weill and Dimon were not merely executive and assistant, or even mentor and protege. They were collaborators in the fullest sense of the word, two minds working in concert, each making the other better, each pushing the other further than either could have gone alone. It is worth pausing to consider what made this particular partnership so consequential, because the history of American business is full of mentor-protege relationships, and most of them, however productive, do not reshape an industry. The Weill-Dimon partnership was different in kind, and not merely in degree from the usual arrangement in which a senior executive takes a younger colleague under his wing. It was different because of the specific qualities each man brought to it, and because of the specific moment in which it took shape. Weill brought a lifetime of experience in the financial services industry, a Rolodex that was the envy of Wall Street, and, perhaps most importantly, a burning, almost desperate desire to get back on top after the humiliation of his marginalization at American Express. He was a man with a vision, but in need of someone who could help him execute it with the precision and discipline that the next chapter of his career would require. Dimon brought intellectual firepower, analytical rigor, boundless energy, and a hunger to prove himself that matched Weill's own. He was a man with extraordinary tools, but in need of a stage on which to deploy them. Each needed the other in a way that was specific and irreplaceable, and it was this mutual need, this perfect complementarity, that gave the partnership its power. The timing was equally crucial. The financial services industry in the early 1980s was on the cusp of a transformation that would fundamentally alter its structure and its culture. Deregulation was loosening the constraints that had kept banking, insurance, and securities in separate silos. Technology was beginning to reshape how financial products were created, distributed, and managed. Globalization was opening new markets and creating new competitive pressures. The old order was crumbling, and in its place, a new order was emerging, one that would be dominated by sprawling financial conglomerates that could offer every conceivable product to every conceivable customer in every conceivable market. Weill understood this transformation intuitively, had been positioning himself for it his entire career. Dimon understood it analytically, could see the logic of consolidation with the clarity that his training and temperament uniquely equipped him to perceive. Together, they were ideally positioned to ride the wave of change that was about to sweep through the industry. But all of that lay ahead. In the early days of the partnership, those first months at American Express, when Dimon was still finding his footing and Weill was still chafing under the constraints of his diminished role, the future was uncertain, the path forward unclear. What was clear to both men was that they had found in each other something rare and precious, a partner who understood, who shared the vision, who was willing to do the work. The rest, the deals, the mergers, the empire building, and the eventual and devastating rupture would come in time. For now, in the early 1980s, in the offices of American Express, a young man from Queens sat across from a veteran dealmaker from Brooklyn, and together they began to plot a course that would carry them both, for better or for worse, through triumph and through heartbreak, to the very summit of the financial world. The partnership between Sandy Weill and Jamie Dimon had begun, and nothing in American finance would ever be quite the same. What neither man could have fully appreciated in those first exhilarating months was the paradox embedded in the very heart of their relationship. The qualities that made them such extraordinary partners, the intensity, the ambition, the absolute commitment to winning, were the same qualities that would eventually make their partnership unsustainable. Two men of such outsized drive and ego could collaborate brilliantly as long as their interests were aligned, as long as the hierarchy between them was clear and accepted by both sides. But as Dimon grew in stature and confidence, as his contributions became impossible to dismiss as those of a mere assistant, the dynamics would inevitably shift. The protege would become a rival, or at least be perceived as one. The apprentice would outgrow the apprenticeship. The son, figuratively speaking, would need to leave the father's house. That eventual transformation was, in many ways, inscribed in the partnership from its very first day. But recognizing the inevitability of a thing is not the same as being prepared for it. And when the break finally came, years later, after they had built an empire together, after they had transformed the landscape of American finance, it would catch both men and everyone around them with the force of an earthquake. In the beginning, though, there was only the work and the extraordinary alignment of two exceptional minds and the intoxicating sense that together they could do anything. It was a partnership forged in ambition and cemented by trust, and for a time, a long, remarkable, history-making time, it was one of the most productive collaborations the world of business had ever seen. The American Express years and departure. The towers of the American Express headquarters at the World Financial Center in Lower Manhattan gleamed with the kind of corporate prestige that Sandy Weill had spent his entire career chasing. When American Express acquired Shearson Lieb Roads in 1981, it was supposed to be the crowning achievement of Weill's long campaign to build the most powerful financial services firm in America, the culmination of nearly 2 decades of relentless deal-making that had transformed a modest back-office brokerage into a Wall Street powerhouse. For Jamie Dimon, barely a year out of Harvard Business School and already deeply enmeshed in Weill's orbit, the merger with American Express represented something equally intoxicating, a front-row seat at one of the most ambitious experiments in financial services history. What neither man could have fully anticipated was that the years ahead would become a bruising education in corporate politics, a masterclass in the difference between building an empire and surviving inside someone else's, and ultimately a crucible that would forge one of the most consequential partnerships in modern finance through the fire of shared defeat. The deal itself had been enormous in scope and ambition. American Express, under the leadership of its patrician chairman James D. Robinson III, paid approximately $930 million for Shearson Loeb Roads, making it the largest acquisition in Wall Street history at the time. Robinson, a genteel Georgian who had ascended through the ranks of American Express with the polished ease of an establishment insider, envisioned creating a financial supermarket, a one-stop shop where affluent consumers could access everything from charge cards and traveler's checks to brokerage services, investment banking, and insurance. It was a vision that would later become commonplace in American finance, but in the early 1980s, it carried the electric charge of genuine innovation. Weill, who had painstakingly assembled Shearson through more than a dozen acquisitions over the previous 15 years, was supposed to be Robinson's partner in this grand experiment. He was named President of American Express, a title that seemed to place him squarely in line for the ultimate prize, the chairmanship itself. For Dimon, the transition into the American Express ecosystem was immediate and total. He had joined Weill's team in the summer of 1982, initially working at American Express's strategic planning group before being pulled directly into Weill's inner circle. His role was deliberately kept fluid. Weill wanted him close, available, and unencumbered by the rigid hierarchies that characterized a large corporation. Dimon served as a kind of all-purpose analyst, advisor, sounding board, and confidant, a young man with an extraordinary facility for numbers who could digest a balance sheet with the same ease that others read a newspaper. His title was modest, something along the lines of assistant to the president, but his actual influence far exceeded what any organizational chart would suggest. He sat in meetings that executives decades his senior would have given their corner offices to attend. He whispered observations into Weill's ear during presentations. He challenged assumptions and questioned deals with a directness that occasionally startled people who didn't understand the unusual chemistry between the stocky, cigar-loving dealmaker and his young protege. The early months were heady. The combined entity, Shearson American Express, was a colossus, one of the largest financial services firms in the world. Weill threw himself into the work of integration with his characteristic intensity, working to meld the entrepreneurial, cost-conscious culture of Shearson with the more bureaucratic traditions of American Express. Dimon was at his side through the long hours, the working dinners, the weekend strategy sessions at Weill's Greenwich estate. They pored over the numbers together, debating which divisions were performing, which executives were delivering results, and where the fat could be trimmed. This was the kind of work that animated them both, the granular, operational grind of making a business run better.
Weill was a builder who loved the details, who could spot an unnecessary expense line buried in a subsidiary's quarterly report, and Dimon shared this obsession with an almost genetic fervor inherited from his own family's background in the brokerage business. But almost from the beginning, fault lines were visible beneath the surface of the grand merger. The cultural collision between Weill's world and Robinson's world was not merely a matter of different management styles. It was a clash of fundamentally different conceptions of what a corporation was for and how power within it should be exercised. Robinson's American Express was a company run by consensus and committee, where decisions percolated through layers of staff and where the social dynamics of the executive suite mattered as much as the bottom line. It was a world of corporate boards and charity galas, of relationships carefully cultivated at the right clubs and the right dinner parties. Robinson himself embodied this culture. He was smooth, diplomatic, and deeply connected to the broader establishment of American business and politics. His wife, Linda Robinson, was a powerful public relations executive who wielded enormous influence in New York social circles, and the couple moved through the upper echelons of Manhattan society with a grace that Weill, for all his wealth and ambition, could never quite replicate. Weill, by contrast, was a man who had built his career not through connections or pedigree, but through sheer force of will and an unerring instinct for the deal. He was rough where Robinson was smooth, direct where Robinson was diplomatic, impatient where Robinson was measured. He had grown up in the scrappy world of Wall Street brokerage operations, where you succeeded by outworking and outthinking your competitors, not by serving on the right nonprofit boards. His idea of corporate culture was a meritocracy of results. You delivered the numbers or you were gone. This fundamental difference in temperament and worldview would prove to be an unbridgeable chasm. For Dimon, navigating this divided landscape required a kind of political awareness that didn't come naturally to him. He was, even at that young age, a person of strong opinions expressed with little diplomatic varnish. Where a more seasoned corporate operator might have recognized the need to build alliances across the organizational divide, to pay court to Robinson's loyalists and earn their trust through patient cultivation, Dimon tended to focus relentlessly on what he believed was right, on the numbers, on the strategy, on the operational logic of whatever question was at hand. This intellectual honesty was one of his greatest strengths, but in the hothouse environment of American Express internal politics, it could also make him enemies. Some of Robinson's allies viewed the young man with suspicion, seeing him as Weill's spy, an extension of the president's ambition rather than a genuine team player in the broader corporate enterprise. The political dynamics grew more fraught as Weill began to discover that the title of president carried less real power than he had expected. Robinson had no intention of ceding operational control of American Express to anyone, regardless of what the organizational chart suggested. Key decisions continued to flow through the chairman's office, and Weill found himself increasingly sidelined from the most important strategic discussions. Initiatives he championed were delayed, diluted, or quietly killed in committee. His cost-cutting instincts, the very thing that had made Shearson so profitable, were met with resistance from American Express lifers who viewed them as an assault on the company's premium brand identity. Why, they wondered, would you pinch pennies at a company whose very name was synonymous with affluence and prestige? Dimon watched this dynamic unfold with growing frustration. He could see, with the cold clarity of someone who lived and breathed financial statements, that American Express was not operating as efficiently as it could be, that there were redundancies and excesses that a more disciplined management would never have tolerated. But he was also beginning to understand something that no business school case study could fully teach, that corporate power was not simply a function of being right. You could have the best analysis, the sharpest insights, the most compelling strategic vision, and still lose if the political terrain was arrayed against you. It was a lesson that would shape his thinking for the rest of his career, this understanding that organizations were not purely rational machines, but deeply human institutions, governed by ego and alliance and fear, as much as by logic and data. The situation was further complicated by the ambitious expansion of the Shearson franchise under the American Express umbrella.
In 1984, Shearson American Express acquired Lehman Brothers Kuhn Loeb, the venerable investment bank, in a deal that was supposed to vault the firm into the front ranks of Wall Street's elite. The combined entity, now called Shearson Lehman American Express, was a sprawling financial services conglomerate with operations spanning retail brokerage, investment banking, asset management, and more. On paper, it was exactly the kind of comprehensive financial powerhouse that both Weill and Robinson had envisioned. In practice, the Lehman acquisition introduced a whole new layer of complexity and conflict into an already strained organization. The Lehman deal was fraught from the start. Lehman Brothers had been tearing itself apart in a vicious internal civil war between its traders and its investment bankers, a conflict so bitter and personal that it had become the stuff of Wall Street legend, later immortalized in Ken Auletta's book Greed and Glory on Wall Street. The firm that Shearson acquired was damaged goods, its culture toxic, its best talent eyeing the exits. Integrating Lehman's proud, prickly investment bankers into the more workmanlike Shearson operation was an enormous management challenge, and it fell largely on Weill's shoulders. But Weill was trying to execute this integration while simultaneously fighting his own political battles within the larger American Express structure, a two-front war that stretched even his formidable energies to the breaking point. Dimon was deeply involved in the Lehman integration work, analyzing the combined firm's operations, identifying areas of overlap, and helping to develop plans for rationalizing the sprawling enterprise. It was grueling, thankless work. Every proposed change threatened someone's turf. Every efficiency measure provoked howls of protest from one constituency or another. The Lehman bankers, many of whom considered themselves the aristocrats of Wall Street, bristled at being managed by what they viewed as a bunch of retail brokers. The Shearson veterans, meanwhile, resented the Lehman contingent's arrogance and their tendency to run through money as if profitability were someone else's concern. Dimon, who had an instinctive feel for which operations were making money and which were burning it, found himself caught in the crossfire of these cultural wars. Through all of this, the relationship between Weill and Robinson continued to deteriorate. It was not a dramatic, explosive conflict. Robinson was too smooth for that, and the early 1980s corporate world was too decorous for open warfare at the top of a major company. Instead, it was a slow, suffocating diminishment, a gradual draining of authority and influence that left Weill feeling increasingly like a figurehead in the company he had done so much to build. Robinson managed to restructure reporting lines so that key executives reported directly to him. In 1984, Shearson American Express acquired Lehman Brothers Kuhn Loeb, the venerable investment bank, in a deal that was supposed to vault the firm into the front ranks of Wall Street's elite. The combined entity, now called Shearson Lehman American Express, was a sprawling financial services conglomerate with operations spanning retail brokerage, investment banking, asset management, and more. On paper, it was exactly the kind of comprehensive financial powerhouse that both Weill and Robinson had envisioned. In practice, the Lehman acquisition introduced a whole new layer of complexity and conflict into an already strained organization. The Lehman deal was fraught from the start. Lehman Brothers had been tearing itself apart in a vicious internal civil war between its traders and its investment bankers, a conflict so bitter and personal that it had become the stuff of Wall Street legend, later immortalized in Ken Auletta's book Greed and Glory on Wall Street. The firm that Shearson acquired was damaged goods, its culture toxic, its best talent eyeing the exits. Integrating Lehman's proud, prickly investment bankers into the more workmanlike Shearson operation was an enormous management challenge, and it fell largely on Weill's shoulders. But Weill was trying to execute this integration while simultaneously fighting his own political battles within the larger American Express structure, a two-front war that stretched even his formidable energies to the breaking point. Dimon was deeply involved in the Lehman integration work, analyzing the combined firm's operations, identifying areas of overlap, and helping to develop plans for rationalizing the sprawling enterprise. It was grueling, thankless work. Every proposed change threatened someone's turf. Every efficiency measure provoked howls of protest from one constituency or another. The Lehman bankers, many of whom considered themselves the aristocrats of Wall Street, bristled at being managed by what they viewed as a bunch of retail brokers. The Shearson veterans, meanwhile, resented the Lehman contingent's arrogance and their tendency to run through money as if profitability were someone else's concern. Dimon, who had an instinctive feel for which operations were making money and which were burning it, found himself caught in the crossfire of these cultural wars. Through all of this, the relationship between Weill and Robinson continued to deteriorate. It was not a dramatic, explosive conflict. Robinson was too smooth for that, and the early 1980s corporate world was too decorous for open warfare at the top of a major company. Instead, it was a slow, suffocating diminishment, a gradual draining of authority and influence that left Weill feeling increasingly like a figurehead in the company he had done so much to build. Robinson managed to restructure reporting lines so that key executives reported directly to him rather than to Weill. Strategic planning functions that Weill had expected to control were kept within the chairman's domain. Social slights compounded professional ones. Weill and his wife Joan felt excluded from the elite social circle that the Robinsons commanded, a world of Manhattan philanthropy and media power that seemed to operate by codes they couldn't quite crack. The personal dimension of this conflict mattered more than a purely business-minded observer might expect. Weill had been indignant by the way he was treated at American Express, and Dimon felt empathy for Weill. It was this empathy that proved decisive when the final crisis came. By 1985, the tension between Weill and Robinson had reached a point of no return. The details of their final falling out were complex, and, depending on who told the story, colored by each party's self-justifying narrative. What is clear is that Weill had become increasingly vocal in his frustrations, both internally and to select confidants outside the company. He felt that Robinson was not only blocking his authority, but actively undermining his reputation within the firm and on Wall Street. Robinson, for his part, had grown weary of what he perceived as Weill's restless ambition and his inability to function as a team player within the American Express structure. The two men had reached the kind of impasse that, in corporate life, can only be resolved by one party's departure. The board of American Express, populated largely by Robinson's allies and establishment figures who shared his worldview, was never going to side with Weill in this contest. Robinson was the chairman, the face of the company, the man who had built American Express into a global brand. Weill was a talented operator, certainly, but he was also a disruptive force, a man whose restless energy and blunt manner made the more refined denizens of the American Express boardroom uncomfortable. When the final reckoning came, Weill found himself without the institutional support he needed to prevail. The manner of Weill's departure from American Express in the summer of 1985 was, by the standards of high-level corporate exits, relatively civil on the surface, but devastating in its implications. He was not fired in the dramatic sense. There was no shouting match, no security escort to the door. Instead, there was a carefully negotiated separation, a mutual agreement dressed up in the language of corporate diplomacy. Weill would step down from his position as president, retaining a seat on the board for a transitional period. The official narrative emphasized his desire to pursue other interests, the natural evolution of a restless entrepreneur who had never been suited to the role of corporate number two. But beneath the polished press releases, everyone on Wall Street understood what had actually happened.
Sandy Weill had been pushed out, outmaneuvered in a political game that rewarded the smooth operator over the operational genius. For Weill, the departure was a shattering experience, the worst professional setback of his life up to that point, and one that plunged him into a period of genuine despair. At 52 years old, he had been exiled from the company he had spent decades building, stripped of his title, his authority, and much of his identity. He had no clear plan for what would come next, no obvious vehicle for his ambitions. The financial press, always eager to write the obituary of a fallen titan, treated his departure as the end of an era. Sandy Weill, the great dealmaker, the man who had built Shearson from nothing, was finished. He was yesterday's news. It was in this moment of crisis that Jamie Dimon's character was most vividly revealed. When Weill left American Express, Dimon faced a genuine choice, and it was not, by any rational calculation, an easy one. He was still a young man in his late 20s, with a career full of potential and options. He could have stayed at Shearson Lehman American Express, where his talent was recognized and where he would have had every opportunity to build an independent career trajectory. The firm was one of the largest and most prominent on Wall Street. There was no shortage of challenging work to be done. Staying would have been the safe, sensible choice, the choice that any career counselor or mentor would have recommended. Weill's departure, after all, was not Dimon's fight. He had no obligation to follow his boss into the wilderness. But Dimon did not see it that way. For him, the question was never really about career optimization or rational calculation. It was about loyalty, about the bond he had forged with Weill over years of shared labor and mutual respect, about a vision of how business should be done that transcended any single corporate address. Dimon had watched Weill build something extraordinary at Shearson, had absorbed his philosophy of cost discipline and operational excellence, had seen firsthand how a determined leader could transform an entire industry through willpower and strategic daring. He had also watched the culture of American Express slowly suffocate that vision, had witnessed the triumph of bureaucratic politics over genuine business acumen. To stay at American Express after Weill's departure would have meant acquiescing to that triumph, accepting the values of an organization that had just expelled the man Dimon most admired in the business world. There was also something deeper at work, something that went beyond professional calculation and even beyond personal loyalty. Dimon had developed during his years at American Express a visceral distaste for the kind of corporate culture that Robinson embodied, the emphasis on image over substance, the tolerance of mediocrity in the name of harmony, the elevation of political skill over operational competence. He had seen how the company's bureaucratic apparatus could grind down even the most talented executives, how good ideas could die in committee, how the fear of offending powerful insiders could paralyze decision-making. Staying at American Express would have meant making peace with that culture, and Dimon was constitutionally incapable of such accommodation. He was his father's son, his grandfather's grandson, a man who believed that business was about results, about serving clients, about building things that worked. The gilt-edged corridors of American Express, with their politics and pretensions, were not where he belonged. The decision to leave was not made in a vacuum. Dimon consulted with his family, talked with friends and colleagues, weighed the practical implications of walking away from a secure position at one of America's most prestigious corporations. His parents, both experienced in the world of finance, understood the risks. His father, Ted Dimon, who had spent his career as a stockbroker and understood the rhythms of Wall Street careers, could appreciate both the courage and the potential folly of his son's choice. There were mortgages to consider, a young family to support, the simple economic reality that a paycheck from American Express was worth something tangible, while the promise of future opportunities with a displaced mentor was worth nothing that could be deposited in a bank. Yet the Dimon family understood something about loyalty and conviction that transcended the spreadsheet, and Jamie's decision, when it came, surprised no one who truly knew him. He followed Weill out the door.
The period that followed, roughly from the summer of 1985 through the end of that year and into early 1986, was one of the most unusual and formative interludes in Dimon's career, precisely because so little of conventional significance happened during it. For a young man who had been operating at the center of Wall Street's most dynamic merger machine, the sudden transition to professional limbo was jarring. Weill, devastated by his ouster and uncertain about his next move, retreated into a kind of restless idleness that was entirely foreign to his nature. He had an office, a small suite at the Seagram building on Park Avenue, far from the humming trading floors and executive suites where he had spent his professional life, but he had no company to run, no deals to make, no organization to manage. He was, for the first time in decades, a man without a mission. Dimon shared this exile, and the experience was both humbling and clarifying. The two men occupied their modest quarters like generals without an army, reviewing financial reports, reading annual statements, scanning the horizon for opportunities that might allow them to get back in the game. Weill's mood during this period swung between depression and restless optimism, and Dimon became not just his business partner, but something closer to a therapist, a confidant, a source of steady reassurance in a time of profound uncertainty. The days could be long and empty. Weill, a man of enormous energy, struggled with the enforced inactivity. He made phone calls, had lunches, played cards, golfed, but nothing could substitute for the adrenaline rush of running a major financial enterprise. Dimon, younger and perhaps more resilient, channeled his energy into analysis, devouring financial statements of potential acquisition targets, studying industries, looking for the opening that would allow them to stage their comeback. The dynamic between the two men during this fallow period deepened in ways that would have lasting consequences. Without the structure of a large organization around them, without the distractions of daily management crises and board meetings and earnings calls, Dimon and Weill were thrown into a more intimate working relationship than they had ever experienced. They spent hours together every day, talking through ideas, debating strategy, arguing about the future of financial services. Dimon, emboldened by the intensity of this one-on-one interaction, began to express his views with greater confidence and force. He was no longer merely the brilliant young assistant deferring to the seasoned dealmaker. He was becoming a genuine intellectual partner, someone whose analytical rigor and strategic instincts Weill increasingly relied upon. The hierarchy between them, while never fully dissolved, Weill was still the senior partner, the man with the reputation and the Rolodex, became more fluid, more collaborative. Dimon pushed back on ideas he thought were flawed, challenged assumptions, insisted on rigorous analysis before any commitment was made. Weill, to his credit, generally welcomed this pushback, recognizing that Dimon's intellectual honesty was one of his greatest assets. But the exile also planted seeds of tension that would not bear fruit for many years.
The intimacy of their partnership during this period created expectations on both sides that would eventually prove irreconcilable. Dimon came to see himself as something approaching an equal partner, not in experience or reputation, certainly, but in contribution, in the quality of his thinking, in the value he brought to whatever enterprise they would build together. Weill, while genuinely grateful for Dimon's loyalty and deeply appreciative of his abilities, never fully shed the mentor's instinct to view his protege as exactly that, a protege, a junior partner, someone who was learning at the master's knee. This asymmetry of perception, invisible during the warmth of their shared exile, would widen over the years into a chasm that neither man could bridge. For the moment, however, the more pressing concern was practical: what to do next. Wall Street is a place that reveres momentum, and Weill's momentum had come to a dead stop. The financial press, never sentimental about former titans, had moved on to newer stories, fresher faces. Friends and former colleagues, while sympathetic, were cautious about associating too closely with a man who had just been ousted from one of America's most powerful companies. The phone calls that had once flooded Weill's office slowed to a trickle.
Invitations to industry events dried up. The social ecosystem of Wall Street, which had embraced Weill when he was riding high, showed its less flattering face now that he was down. This experience, the fickleness of Wall Street friendships, the cruelty of a culture that measured human worth in quarterly earnings and deal flow, left a lasting impression on both men. For Weill, it reinforced his instinct that the only security in business lay in being the boss, in controlling one's own destiny rather than depending on the goodwill of others. For Dimon, it offered a masterclass in the difference between genuine relationships and transactional ones, a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his career. The emotional texture of this period should not be underestimated. Weill was genuinely depressed, not in the clinical sense, perhaps, but in the way that profoundly driven men become depressed when their sense of purpose is stripped away. He second-guessed the decisions that had led to his ouster, replayed conversations with Robinson, wondered whether different tactics might have produced a different outcome. There were moments of bitterness, of anger directed at the board members who had failed to support him, at the colleagues who had stood by while his authority was eroded. Dimon witnessed all of this, and the experience gave him a nuanced understanding of the emotional dimensions of corporate life that no business school curriculum could provide. He saw how power lost could unmoor even the strongest personality, how identity and occupation could become so entangled that losing one felt like losing the other. He also saw how Weill, despite his despair, never fully surrendered to it, how the old fighter's instinct kept reasserting itself, how the desire to build, to compete, to prove the doubters wrong gradually displaced the grief and self-recrimination. It was during this wilderness period that Dimon's own ambitions began to crystallize with greater definition. At American Express, he had been learning, absorbing, developing his skills within the framework of someone else's vision. Now, untethered from the institutional structures that had shaped his early career, he had the space to think about what he himself wanted to build. The financial services industry was entering a period of profound transformation in the mid-1980s. Deregulation, which had begun in earnest during the Carter administration and accelerated under Reagan, was redrawing the boundaries between banking, insurance, and securities. Technological change was creating new possibilities for data-driven management and cost reduction. The old walls that had separated different sectors of the financial industry, walls erected in the aftermath of the Great Depression by laws like Glass-Steagall, were beginning to crack, creating opportunities for entrepreneurs bold enough to imagine a different kind of financial company. Dimon, with his analytical mind and his appetite for understanding complex systems, grasped these trends intuitively. He began to envision the kind of company he and Weill might build, a diversified financial services firm that could exploit the emerging opportunities in ways that the sleepy, compartmentalized incumbents could not. This vision was not, of course, entirely original. The concept of the financial supermarket, a single company offering banking, insurance, brokerage, and asset management under one roof, had been floating around Wall Street for years, and indeed it was part of what had motivated the American Express acquisition of Shearson in the first place.
But Dimon brought to this vision a rigor and a specificity that distinguished it from the vague aspirations of corporate planners. He didn't just want to assemble a collection of financial businesses. He wanted to build an integrated enterprise where shared infrastructure, disciplined cost management, and superior customer service created genuine competitive advantages. He had seen at American Express what happened when acquisitions were bolted together without real integration: the redundancies, the culture clashes, the wasted resources. Whatever came next, he was determined that it would be different. The months of exile also served as a period of physical and emotional renewal for both men, even if it didn't feel that way at the time. Weill, forced out of the all-consuming rhythm of corporate life, spent more time with his family, reconnected with friends outside the financial world, and gradually recovered something of the equanimity that his bruising final years at American Express had eroded. Dimon, too, used the time to attend to dimensions of his life that the relentless pace of Wall Street had pushed to the margins. He and his wife Judy, whom he had married in 1983, were building a life together, and the relative calm of the exile, compared to the frenetic years at Shearson and American Express, gave him space to be more present in that life. These personal dimensions of the story are easy to overlook in the narrative of corporate ambition and strategic maneuvering, but they mattered. The men who would eventually stage one of the most remarkable comebacks in American business history were not abstract figures in a case study. They were human beings whose motivations were shaped by love, pride, fear, loyalty, and the simple desire to prove that they were not finished. As the months wore on, the question of what came next acquired increasing urgency. Weill was not the kind of man who could remain idle indefinitely. His need to build, to manage, to compete was as fundamental to his nature as breathing. He and Dimon examined dozens of potential opportunities: small banks, insurance companies, brokerage firms, consumer finance operations. They looked at deals and walked away from them, started negotiations and broke them off, pursued leads that turned into dead ends. The process was frustrating, but it was also educational. Each potential acquisition they analyzed deepened their understanding of the financial landscape, sharpened their sense of where the real opportunities lay, refined their criteria for what would make a suitable platform for their ambitions. Dimon, with his gift for financial analysis, played a critical role in this process, evaluating companies with a thoroughness that left no stone unturned. He built models, scrutinized balance sheets, interviewed industry experts, assessed management teams. This was not glamorous work. It was the financial equivalent of panning for gold, sifting through mountains of ordinary rock in search of something precious. But it was essential, and Dimon excelled at it. The experience at American Express had taught both men crucial lessons that would inform everything they did going forward. From Weill's perspective, the most important lesson was about control. He had sold Shearson to American Express in part because he believed he could eventually run the larger company. But the reality had been very different. He had been absorbed into someone else's organization, subject to someone else's authority, dependent on someone else's goodwill. Never again, he vowed, would he put himself in a position where his fate was controlled by others. Whatever he built next, he would be the one in charge, the chairman, the CEO, the ultimate decision-maker. This determination to maintain absolute control would be one of the defining characteristics of his subsequent career, and it would have profound implications for his relationship with Dimon. For Dimon, the lessons of the American Express years were more multifaceted. He had learned about the mechanics of large-scale corporate management, the challenges of integrating diverse businesses, the importance of cost discipline, the dangers of bureaucratic inertia. He had seen how a great company could be undermined by poor strategic decisions and internal politics, how the pursuit of prestige and diversification could lead an organization away from its core competencies. He had observed the dynamics of power at the highest levels of corporate America, had seen how boards operated, how political alliances were formed and dissolved, how the fate of thousands of employees could hinge on the personal chemistry between two strong-willed leaders. These were lessons that no amount of academic study could have provided, and they gave Dimon a sophistication about corporate life that far exceeded what his relatively young age might have suggested. Perhaps most importantly, the American Express experience had taught Dimon about the relationship between culture and performance. He'd seen two corporate cultures collide, Weill's scrappy, cost-conscious, results-oriented culture, and Robinson's polished, image-conscious, politically sophisticated culture, and he had seen which one the American Express board preferred. The outcome had not been determined by which culture produced better business results. It had been determined by which culture was more palatable to the people who held institutional power. This was a sobering lesson, but it did not lead Dimon to conclude that culture didn't matter or that politics always trumped substance. Instead, it reinforced his conviction that building the right culture was essential, but that the right culture had to be accompanied by the right governance structure, one that rewarded performance rather than political skill. The leader who controlled the organization, who set its tone, and defined its values, had to be someone who genuinely cared about results, about customers, about building something that worked. The American Express experience had shown him what happened when that alignment broke down. The American Express chapter of Dimon's life closed not with a single dramatic moment, but with a gradual transition from the intensity of the corporate battleground to the quiet uncertainty of exile, and then to the slow, determined search for a new beginning. When Dimon looked back on this period years later, from the vantage point of extraordinary success, he would acknowledge both its pain and its value. The experience had hardened him, sharpened him, given him a clarity of purpose that the comfortable trajectory of a conventional corporate career might never have provided. He had learned what he valued and what he despised, what kind of leader he wanted to be, and what kind of organization he wanted to build. He had been tested by adversity and had chosen loyalty over safety, conviction over comfort. And he had forged, in the crucible of shared struggle, a partnership with Sandy Weill that would carry both men to heights neither could have imagined during those long, quiet days in the Seagram building. The wilderness would not last forever. Weill's restless energy and Dimon's analytical brilliance were too potent a combination to remain sidelined for long. The financial world was changing rapidly, creating openings for men with the vision to see them and the courage to seize them. Somewhere out there, waiting to be discovered, was the vehicle that would carry both men back to the center of American finance. The search for that vehicle and the transformation it would undergo in their hands would become the next great chapter in both their stories. But first, the exile had to run its course, and the lessons of American Express had to be fully absorbed. In the silence of those fallow months, in the space between what had been and what was yet to come, Jamie Dimon was becoming the leader he was destined to be. The young man who had followed his mentor into the wilderness was preparing, whether he fully realized it or not, to build an empire of his own. Building commercial credit and the Primerica acquisition. The offices were modest, almost shockingly so. After the soaring marble lobbies and mahogany-paneled boardrooms of American Express, the headquarters of Commercial Credit Company in Baltimore, Maryland, felt like a different universe entirely. The building sat along the waterfront, a functional structure that housed a consumer finance operation most Wall Street titans would have considered beneath their notice. It was the kind of place where people took out small loans to buy washing machines or consolidate credit card debt. A business built on $500 and $1,000 transactions, far removed from the rarefied air of global investment banking and insurance conglomerates. When Sandy Weill first laid eyes on it in the autumn of 1986, he didn't see what everyone else saw. He didn't see a backwater. He saw a beachhead. Jamie Dimon saw it too. At 29 years old, he had already absorbed enough from his years alongside Weill at American Express to understand a fundamental truth that would animate their partnership for the next decade. It didn't matter where you started. What mattered was where you intended to go and whether you had the discipline, the intellect, and the ruthlessness to get there. Commercial Credit Company was nobody's idea of a glamorous launching pad, but it was publicly traded, it generated real cash flow, and it could serve as the corporate vehicle through which Weill and Dimon could begin assembling their next empire. Sometimes the best castles are built on the most unlikely foundations. The path to Baltimore had been anything but straightforward. After Weill's departure from American Express in the summer of 1985, a humiliating denouement to what was supposed to have been his crowning achievement, both men found themselves in a kind of professional wilderness. Weill, the legendary dealmaker who had built Shearson from a tiny brokerage into a powerhouse, was suddenly a man without a company, without a title, without a platform. He spent months in a fog of restlessness, making phone calls, taking meetings, casting about for the next opportunity with the anxious energy of someone who defined himself entirely through work and found himself, for the first time in decades, without any. He consulted briefly, explored various possibilities, and waited for the phone to ring with the kind of opportunity that would justify his ambitions. For Dimon, the interim period was shorter and more purposeful. He had left American Express alongside Weill, an act of loyalty that some considered foolish for such a young man with such a promising career ahead of him. He could have stayed. Peter Cohen, who had replaced Weill at Shearson, would likely have found a place for the talented young Harvard MBA. Others at American Express recognized Dimon's abilities and would have been happy to keep him in the fold. But Dimon's bond with Weill was by now something more than professional obligation. It was a partnership forged in shared ambition and mutual respect, complicated by elements of a surrogate father-son dynamic that would prove to be both its greatest strength and, eventually, its fatal weakness. Dimon followed Weill out the door, trusting that wherever the older man landed, there would be room and opportunity for both of them. The commercial credit opportunity materialized through the kind of serendipity that shapes business history. Control Data Corporation, a Minneapolis-based computer company that had diversified aggressively during the 1970s and early 1980s, was now retrenching. Under financial pressure and refocusing on its core technology operations, Control Data had decided to shed its consumer finance subsidiary. Commercial Credit Company had been a reasonably profitable operation. It made small consumer loans, offered insurance products, and served a customer base that the prestige financial institutions wouldn't touch. But it was ancillary to Control Data's mission and strategy. The parent company wanted to spin it off, and they needed someone credible to run it. When the opportunity came to Weill's attention, likely through his extensive network of contacts in the financial services industry, his initial reaction might have seemed like that of a man willing to accept almost anything just to get back in the game. And in a sense, that was true. But there was something more calculated at work. Weill had spent his career studying the architecture of financial conglomerates, and he understood that commercial credit, for all its pedestrian qualities, possessed certain structural advantages that made it an ideal platform. It was a public company, which meant it had access to capital markets. It had a functioning infrastructure, offices, employees, systems, regulatory relationships. It generated steady, if unspectacular, cash flows from its lending operations. And most importantly, it was available. In the deal-making world, the best opportunity is often simply the one that presents itself at the right moment to someone prepared to seize it. Weill and Dimon took the plunge. In November 1986, they orchestrated a management-led buyout of commercial credit from Control Data. The transaction was structured as a public offering. Commercial credit would be spun off as an independent company with Weill installed as chairman and CEO. The mechanics of the deal required them to raise capital. Weill personally invested roughly $7 million of his own money, a significant commitment that signaled his seriousness to both investors and employees. Dimon also invested, putting up a portion of his own savings. The deal valued commercial credit at approximately $850 million. To Wall Street observers, accustomed to seeing Weill operate on a much grander stage, it seemed almost quaint. Some openly questioned whether the great Sandy Weill had finally been reduced to running a small-time lending shop in Baltimore. The skeptics misunderstood everything. From the very first day, Weill and Dimon operated as if they were running a Fortune 100 corporation, applying the same intensity, rigor, and strategic vision that they would have brought to any major financial institution. They arrived in Baltimore with a clear philosophy that Dimon had helped refine during their years together. Cut costs ruthlessly, improve operational efficiency, demand accountability at every level, and use the freed-up capital and improved earnings to fuel the next acquisition. It was the playbook they had run at Shearson years earlier, adapted now for a very different starting point, but aimed at the same ultimate destination. Dimon threw himself into the work with a ferocity that startled even those who thought they knew him. Despite his youth and his Harvard pedigree, he was never the kind of executive who stayed at altitude, reviewing summary memos and issuing directives from behind a desk. He dove into the operational details of commercial credit's business with an almost obsessive thoroughness. He wanted to understand every line item on the balance sheet. He wanted to know why the company was spending what it was spending. He wanted to meet the people running the branch offices, understand the underwriting criteria for consumer loans, dissect the performance metrics of every business unit. Colleagues from this period would later recall that Dimon seemed to work around the clock, fueled by a combination of intellectual curiosity, competitive drive, and the sheer exhilaration of finally being in a position where he had real authority to make decisions and shape outcomes. The cost-cutting was immediate and dramatic. Weill had always been famous, some would say infamous, for his attention to expenses. He was a kind of CEO who would notice if the budget for office supplies seemed high, who would question why a division needed as many people as it employed, who would scrutinize travel expenses and entertainment budgets with the same intensity that other executives reserved for strategic planning sessions. Dimon shared this instinct, but he added to it an analytical rigor that was distinctly his own. Where Weill operated partly on gut instinct and decades of experience, Dimon brought a systematic, numbers-driven approach to cost management that left no corner of the organization unexplored. Together, they began transforming commercial credit from the inside out. Redundant positions were eliminated, underperforming branches were closed or consolidated, procurement practices were overhauled, technology systems were upgraded where necessary, and stripped of unnecessary complexity where possible. The message cascaded through the organization with unmistakable clarity. Every dollar matters, every expense must be justified, and the era of corporate complacency is over. For employees accustomed to the relatively relaxed culture of a subsidiary tucked within a larger conglomerate, the arrival of Weill and Dimon was something like a controlled hurricane, disorienting, sometimes painful, but ultimately transformative. The results came faster than almost anyone outside the company had expected. Within months, commercial credit's profitability began to improve markedly. The cost reductions flowed directly to the bottom line, and the improved financial performance began to attract attention from investors and analysts who had initially dismissed the Baltimore operation as a curiosity. The stock price, which had debuted modestly during the spin-off from Control Data, began to climb. Weill and Dimon were building a track record, demonstrating to the market that they could take an underperforming asset and, through sheer operational discipline, unlock value that others had failed to see. But the operational turnaround at commercial credit was never intended to be an end in itself. It was always, from the very beginning, a means to a much larger end. Weill and Dimon were building a war chest, accumulating the financial credibility, the market capitalization, and the organizational capability that would allow them to make acquisitions. The consumer finance company was a platform, a launching pad, a corporate vehicle through which they intended to reassemble something like the financial empire Weill had been forced to surrender when he left American Express. The question was not whether they would make their first major acquisition, but when and what. The answer came in 1988, and it was audacious almost beyond belief. Primerica Corporation was on the surface everything that commercial credit was not. It was a sprawling, diversified corporation with deep roots in the American financial establishment. The company's lineage traced back to American Can Company, one of the great old-line industrial corporations that had been a fixture of the American business landscape for the better part of the 20th century. Under the leadership of Gerald T. Sy Jr., the former Fidelity fund manager who had become one of Wall Street's most celebrated figures during the go-go years of the 1960s, American Can had undergone a dramatic metamorphosis. Sy had systematically transformed the company from a manufacturer of packaging products into a diversified financial services conglomerate, eventually renaming it Primerica to signal the completeness of its reinvention. By the late 1980s, Primerica's portfolio of businesses was impressive on paper.
Its crown jewel was Smith Barney Harris Upham & Company, one of Wall Street's most respected brokerage and investment banking firms. Smith Barney carried the kind of brand recognition and institutional prestige that money alone couldn't buy, a name that evoked the old money sophistication of Wall Street's establishment, a firm that prided itself on serving wealthy individuals and institutional clients with a level of personal attention that the industry's mass-market competitors couldn't match. Beyond Smith Barney, Primerica also controlled A.L. Williams & Associates, one of the largest life insurance marketing organizations in the country, known for its army of independent agents who sold term life insurance to middle-class families with an almost evangelical fervor.
The company had other financial services operations as well, creating a conglomerate that, while not always perfectly managed, possessed genuine scale and diversity. But Primerica, for all its assets, was a company with problems. Gerald Cy's financial alchemy, transforming a can company into a financial services firm, had been visionary in concept, but sometimes messy in execution. The various businesses within the Primerica portfolio did not always fit together neatly. Integration had been incomplete. The corporate culture was fragmented, with Smith Barney's pinstriped Wall Street ethos coexisting uneasily alongside the populist, almost blue-collar energy of the A.L. Williams insurance operation. Overhead costs were high, certain business lines were underperforming, and Cy himself, though brilliant in many respects, was not the kind of operational manager who could wring maximum efficiency from a complex, multi-business enterprise. He was a deal-maker and a visionary, not a cost-cutter. For Weill and Dimon, Primerica represented the opportunity of a lifetime, but only if they could find a way to execute a transaction that, by any conventional measure, seemed impossible. The problem was simple arithmetic. Commercial credit, despite its improved financial performance, was dramatically smaller than Primerica. It was, as one observer would later put it, the equivalent of a minnow trying to swallow a whale. Commercial credit's market capitalization was a fraction of Primerica's. Its revenues were a fraction of Primerica's. By every measure that Wall Street typically used to evaluate the relative size and stature of potential merger partners, commercial credit had no business making a bid for Primerica. But Weill and Dimon had no intention of being constrained by conventional measures. They understood something that many of their peers on Wall Street either missed or refused to accept, that in the world of corporate acquisitions, creative structuring and bold negotiation could overcome almost any arithmetic disadvantage. The key was finding the right combination of financing, the right pitch to the target company's board and shareholders, and the right moment in the market to make a move. The first crucial step was understanding Primerica's vulnerabilities. Despite its impressive collection of businesses, the company's stock was trading at what Weill and Dimon believed was a significant discount to the underlying value of its assets. This is a phenomenon that often afflicts conglomerates. When a company houses multiple diverse businesses under one corporate umbrella, investors frequently apply what is known as a conglomerate discount, valuing the whole at less than the sum of its parts, because of perceived inefficiencies, management complexity, and the difficulty of evaluating the company's true earning power. Weill and Dimon looked at Primerica and saw a classic conglomerate discount situation, a company whose individual pieces, properly managed and efficiently operated, were substantially more than the market was giving it credit for. The second crucial insight was about Gerald Cy himself. Cy was not a young man fighting to preserve his empire. He had accomplished what he set out to do, transforming American Can into a financial services company, and by the late 1980s, he was open to the right kind of deal. He recognized that Primerica's businesses needed a different kind of leadership, the operational intensity and financial discipline that he himself was neither inclined nor equipped to provide. This created an opening. If Weill could approach Cy not as a hostile raider, but as a partner who respected what Cy had built while offering a vision for how to make it even better, there was a real possibility of a negotiated transaction, a friendly merger that would avoid the costs, uncertainties, and reputational damage of a hostile takeover. Weill deployed every ounce of his legendary interpersonal skill in courting Cy. The two men were both immigrant sons who had risen to the pinnacle of American finance, Weill from a modest Jewish family in Brooklyn, Cy from a Chinese family in Shanghai. Both had proved themselves against long odds in an industry that was not always welcoming to outsiders. There was a natural basis for mutual respect, and Weill cultivated it assiduously, meeting with Cy repeatedly, laying out his vision for what the combined entity could become, and gradually winning Cy's confidence that a merger would serve the interests of Primerica's shareholders, employees, and customers. Dimon, meanwhile, was doing what he did best, running the numbers. The financial engineering required to make the deal work was extraordinarily complex. Commercial credit would essentially be acquiring a company several times its own size, using a combination of stock, cash, and borrowed money. The structure would technically be a reverse merger. Primerica would acquire commercial credit, but Weill and his team would effectively take control of the combined entity, with Weill becoming chairman and CEO of the new Primerica Corporation. This kind of financial jujitsu required meticulous planning, detailed financial modeling, and the ability to present the transaction to investors, analysts, regulators, and rating agencies in a way that made the economics compelling despite the apparent size mismatch. Dimon spent weeks buried in spreadsheets and financial projections, working alongside investment bankers and lawyers to structure the deal in a way that would satisfy all constituencies. He analyzed Primerica's businesses with the same granular intensity he had brought to commercial credit's operations, identifying where costs could be cut, where revenues could be enhanced, and where the combination of the two companies' operations could create synergies that would justify the acquisition premium. His work was essential to building the case that the deal would create value, not just for Weill and Dimon personally, but for the shareholders of both companies. The negotiations were intense and protracted. Sy, for all his willingness to engage, was no pushover. He had his own financial advisors, his own board of directors to answer to, and his own interests to protect. The terms of the merger had to be structured in a way that gave Primerica's shareholders a fair premium for their stock, while still leaving enough upside for commercial credit's shareholders, including Weill and Dimon, to make the deal worthwhile. Every aspect of the transaction was negotiated and renegotiated. The exchange ratio for the stock swap, the treatment of outstanding debt, the governance structure of the combined company, the role that Sy and other Primerica executives would play after the merger closed. Through it all, Dimon served as the analytical backbone of the negotiating team, the person who could translate strategic vision into financial reality. When a particular deal structure was proposed, it was Dimon who would retreat to his office, or more often, a conference room littered with takeout containers and legal pads, to model the implications. What would the combined company's earnings per share look like in year 1, year 3? How would the deal affect the credit ratings of both entities? What would happen to the balance sheet under various interest rate scenarios? These were not academic exercises. The answers to these questions determined whether the deal could actually be done and on what terms. Dimon's facility with numbers gave Weill an enormous advantage at the bargaining table. While other negotiators might have to pause, consult their advisors, and return with an answer, Weill could turn to Dimon and get a near instantaneous read on whether a particular proposal was financially viable. It was like having a living, breathing calculator with the strategic judgment of a seasoned executive sitting right beside you. The deal was announced on August 26, 1988, and the financial world took notice. The combined company would retain the Primerica name, a concession to Sy and to the brand equity that the name carried, but there was no question about who was in charge. Sandy Weill would become chairman and chief executive officer of the new Primerica Corporation, with broad authority over strategy, operations, and personnel decisions. Gerald Sy would become chairman of the executive committee, a title that sounded impressive but carried considerably less operational power. The deal valued Primerica at approximately $1.5 billion, a significant premium to where its stock had been trading before merger discussions became public. For commercial credit's shareholders, the transaction represented a breathtaking leap in scale. They were going from owning a piece of a Baltimore-based consumer finance company to holding stock in a diversified financial services conglomerate with operations spanning insurance, brokerage, consumer lending, and specialty retailing. For Jamie Dimon, the deal was transformative in a deeply personal sense. At the age of 32, he was about to become one of the most senior executives at a major financial services company. His title would be Chief Financial Officer and Executive Vice President of the new Primerica Corporation, a staggering ascent for someone who had graduated from Harvard Business School less than 6 years earlier. But the title only hinted at his actual influence. Within the organization, Everyone understood that Dimon was Weill's closest confidant, his intellectual sparring partner, and the person most responsible for translating the chairman's strategic ambitions into executable plans. When people wanted to know what Weill was really thinking, they called Dimon. When Weill wanted an unvarnished assessment of whether an idea was brilliant or foolish, he turned to Dimon. The relationship between the two men had deepened and intensified through the pressure of the commercial credit turnaround and the Primerica negotiations, forged in the crucible of shared risk, shared adversity, and now shared triumph. But the deal's announcement was merely the beginning of what would prove to be one of the most demanding periods in Dimon's young career. Closing the transaction required navigating a labyrinth of regulatory approvals, shareholder votes, and legal formalities that stretched over several months. Insurance regulators in multiple states had to approve the change of control of Primerica's insurance subsidiaries. The Securities and Exchange Commission had to review and approve the proxy statements sent to shareholders of both companies. Rating agencies had to evaluate the creditworthiness of the combined entity and determine whether the merger would trigger downgrades in either company's debt ratings, a potentially devastating outcome that could raise borrowing costs and undermine the financial logic of the transaction. Dimon was deeply involved in managing all of these work streams, coordinating with lawyers, bankers, accountants, and regulators to ensure that the deal stayed on track and closed on schedule. The shareholder votes, when they came, were anticlimactic. The deal was approved by overwhelming margins at both companies, but the real work began after the merger closed in early 1989. Integrating two large organizations with different cultures, different systems, and different ways of doing business is among the most challenging tasks in corporate management, and the commercial credit Primerica merger was no exception. Indeed, in some respects, it was harder than most because the two companies were so fundamentally different. Commercial credit was a lean, focused, cost-conscious operation that Weill and Dimon had spent 2 years whipping into shape. Primerica was a sprawling conglomerate with multiple business lines, each with its own management team, its own culture, and its own way of measuring success. Bringing these disparate organizations together required not just financial engineering, but cultural transformation. And that transformation, in turn, required a combination of vision, discipline, and sheer force of will. Dimon threw himself into the integration with characteristic intensity. He was everywhere at once, reviewing the books of individual business units, meeting with division heads, interrogating middle managers about their operations, and demanding explanations for expenditures that seemed excessive or unnecessary. His approach was methodical and relentless. He would start with the numbers, drilling into the financial statements of each business unit until he understood its cost structure, revenue drivers, and profitability at a granular level. Then he would visit the operations in person, walking the floors, talking to employees, and observing how work was actually done. This combination of financial analysis and boots-on-the-ground observation gave him a remarkably detailed understanding of the combined company's operations, knowledge that he used to identify opportunities for cost savings, process improvements, and strategic realignment. The cost-cutting was swift and at times painful. Weill and Dimon applied the same philosophy to Primerica that they had applied to commercial credit. Every dollar of expense had to justify its existence by contributing to revenue generation or operational necessity. Redundant corporate functions were consolidated. Overlapping operations were merged. Underperforming business units were put on notice that they needed to improve their results or face divestiture. The headcount reductions that accompanied these changes were significant, and they generated the kind of anxiety and resentment that always accompany large-scale corporate restructurings. Employees who had been comfortable in their roles at Primerica suddenly found themselves reporting to new bosses, working under new performance expectations, and facing the very real possibility that their jobs might be eliminated. Dimon was unflinching in executing these changes, a quality that earned him respect in some quarters and animosity in others. He believed, passionately and vocally, that a company owed its shareholders the highest possible return on their investment, and that achieving that return required a disciplined approach to cost management. He had no patience for what he regarded as corporate bloat.
excessive perquisites, redundant layers of management, or expenditures that served the comfort of executives rather than the interests of the business. When he identified an expense that he believed was wasteful, he eliminated it, regardless of whose feelings might be hurt in the process. This was not, in Dimon's view, cruelty. It was responsibility. A company that tolerated waste was a company that was shortchanging its shareholders and ultimately its employees as well, because an inefficient company was a vulnerable company, one that might not survive in an increasingly competitive marketplace. The most significant business that came with the Primerica acquisition, and the one that would prove most consequential for the future trajectory of both Weill and Dimon's careers, was Smith Barney, the brokerage and investment banking firm. Smith Barney had been acquired by Primerica's predecessor company, and it represented a major foothold in the lucrative world of Wall Street. For Weill, who had built his original fortune in the brokerage business at Shearson, having Smith Barney in the portfolio was like coming home. He understood the economics of the brokerage industry intimately, knew where the inefficiencies were, and had a clear vision of how Smith Barney could be transformed into a more profitable, more competitive enterprise. Dimon shared Weill's excitement about Smith Barney, but his enthusiasm was tempered by a clear-eyed assessment of the firm's challenges. Smith Barney was a respected name on Wall Street, but it was far from the top tier of investment banks. Its trading operations were modest compared to those of Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley. Its investment banking franchise, while solid, lacked the deal flow and prestige of the industry leaders. Its brokerage network was profitable, but in need of modernization and expansion. Turning Smith Barney into a genuine powerhouse would require significant investment, strategic repositioning, and the recruitment of top talent, all while maintaining the cost discipline that was the hallmark of the Weill-Dimon management philosophy. The integration of Smith Barney into the broader Primerica organization became one of Dimon's primary responsibilities, and it provided him with his first sustained exposure to the world of investment banking and capital markets. This was a crucial period in his professional development because it expanded his expertise beyond consumer finance and insurance into the more complex and volatile realm of securities trading, underwriting, and advisory services. Dimon approached the learning curve with the same voracious appetite for knowledge that had characterized his time at Tufts and Harvard Business School. He spent hours with Smith Barney's traders and bankers, learning the mechanics of their businesses, understanding the risks they were taking, and evaluating the returns they were generating. He studied the competitive landscape of the securities industry, analyzing the strategies and financial performance of Smith Barney's rivals, and developing a point of view on where Smith Barney needed to invest and where it needed to retreat. This period also revealed something important about Dimon's character and ambition. He was not content to be simply a financial analyst or a cost cutter. He wanted to be an operator, someone who built businesses, made strategic decisions, and took responsibility for the outcomes. His involvement in the Smith Barney integration went far beyond reviewing spreadsheets and approving budgets. He was actively involved in strategic decisions about which business lines to expand, which clients to pursue, and which risks to take. He pushed for investments in Smith Barney's research capabilities, believing that high-quality research was essential to attracting and retaining institutional clients. He advocated for a more aggressive approach to investment banking, arguing that Smith Barney needed to move up market and compete for the kinds of high-profile advisory mandates that generated enormous fees and reputational capital. At the same time, Dimon remained vigilant about costs and risk management. He insisted on rigorous controls over Smith Barney's trading operations, demanding detailed daily reports on positions, exposures, and profit and loss figures. He questioned compensation practices that he believed were excessive, pushing back against the Wall Street culture of paying traders and bankers enormous bonuses, even when their performance was mediocre. This willingness to challenge conventional wisdom about compensation earned him enemies within Smith Barney,
particularly among senior bankers and traders who were accustomed to being lavishly rewarded and were not inclined to accept cost-cutting directives from a 30-something financial executive from Baltimore. But Dimon's approach produced results, and results were the currency that mattered most to Sandy Weill. Under the new management regime, Smith Barney's profitability improved markedly. Costs were brought under control without destroying the firm's ability to compete for business. Revenue grew as Smith Barney's enhanced research capabilities and more aggressive investment banking strategy attracted new clients and generated new fee income. The brokerage network was modernized, with investments in technology and training that improved the productivity of financial advisors and the satisfaction of their clients. By any reasonable measure, the integration of Smith Barney into Primerica was a success, not a flawless one, certainly, but a success that demonstrated the viability of the Weill-Dimon approach to corporate management. Beyond Smith Barney, the Primerica acquisition brought a diverse array of businesses under the Weill-Dimon umbrella that required attention and, in many cases, decisive action. There was A.L. Williams, the insurance sales operation that had been one of Primerica's most distinctive assets. Founded by Arthur L. Williams, Jr., a former high school football coach who had built a massive network of part-time insurance agents selling term life insurance, A.L. Williams was hugely profitable, but culturally alien to the buttoned-down world of corporate finance. Its sales force operated with an evangelical fervor that could border on the cultish, with motivational rallies that resembled revival meetings more than business conferences. Managing this unique organization, harnessing its energy and profitability, while imposing the kinds of financial controls and compliance standards that a major financial services company required, was a delicate balancing act. Dimon's approach to A.L. Williams illustrated his pragmatic streak. He recognized that the insurance operation was enormously valuable and that its unorthodox sales culture was a key source of its competitive advantage. Rather than trying to impose a conventional corporate framework that would have stifled the very qualities that made the business successful, he focused on strengthening the financial controls and compliance oversight surrounding the operation, while largely leaving its sales culture intact. It was a calculated judgment. The benefits of preserving the entrepreneurial energy of the A.L. Williams network outweighed the costs of its occasional excesses. This willingness to tolerate cultural eccentricity in the service of financial performance was a more nuanced approach than Dimon sometimes received credit for. He was not, despite his reputation, simply a slash-and-burn cost cutter. He was a manager who understood that different businesses required different approaches, and who was capable of adapting his style to the demands of the situation. The period immediately following the Primerica acquisition was also significant for the evolution of the relationship between Weill and Dimon. The success of the deal cemented Dimon's position as Weill's indispensable partner, but it also subtly shifted the dynamics between them. Dimon was no longer a protege in any meaningful sense. He was a co-builder, a key architect of an enterprise that was rapidly becoming one of the most important financial services companies in America. He had opinions of his own, a growing reputation in his own right, and an increasingly independent sense of how the company should be run.
This was, in many ways, a natural and healthy evolution, but it also contained within it the seeds of future tension. Weill was accustomed to being the unquestioned leader, the visionary whose authority was not subject to challenge. Dimon, for his part, was not inclined to defer simply out of deference to hierarchy or tradition. He spoke his mind, pushed back when he disagreed, and was not above going around Weill to implement decisions he believed were correct. These qualities, which had made Dimon invaluable during the early years of the partnership, when Weill needed someone who would challenge his assumptions and keep him intellectually honest, would eventually become sources of friction as both men's ambitions grew and the stakes of their decisions escalated. But in the immediate aftermath of the Primerica deal, those tensions were still largely beneath the surface. What dominated the landscape was a shared sense of accomplishment and possibility. In less than 3 years, Weill and Dimon had taken a small, struggling consumer finance company in Baltimore and transformed it into a diversified financial services conglomerate with billions of dollars in assets, a major brokerage franchise, a massive insurance operation, and a growing presence in investment banking. The trajectory was nothing short of remarkable, and it validated the fundamental premise that had guided both men's careers, that financial services companies could be built through disciplined acquisition, rigorous cost management, and the relentless pursuit of operational excellence. The Primerica acquisition was, in many ways, the deal that put Jamie Dimon on the map. Before Primerica, he was known primarily within the tight circle of people who followed Sandy Weill's career, a talented young executive with impressive credentials and an obvious work ethic, but not yet a figure of independent significance. After Primerica, he was recognized as a force in his own right, a senior executive at a major financial services company, a shrewd dealmaker, and a relentless operator who had demonstrated the ability to analyze, acquire, and integrate complex businesses. Industry publications began profiling him, headhunters started calling, other financial services CEOs took note of the young executive who seemed to be the driving force behind much of the operational improvement at the newly enlarged Primerica. The transformation of commercial credit from a Baltimore backwater into the platform for a financial services empire stands as one of the most impressive feats of corporate strategy in the 1980s. It required vision, the ability to see in a struggling consumer finance company the raw material from which something much larger could be built. It required courage, the willingness to risk careers, reputations, and personal fortunes on a bet that defied conventional wisdom. It required skill, the financial acumen to structure complex transactions, the operational expertise to cut costs and improve performance, and the interpersonal finesse to negotiate with boards, regulators, and rival executives. And it required partnership, the extraordinary collaboration between Sandy Weill and Jamie Dimon, two very different men whose complementary talents produced results that neither could have achieved alone. As 1989 drew to a close and the integration of Primerica progressed, the newly combined company stood at an inflection point. The hard work of consolidation was ongoing, but the strategic direction was clear. Weill and Dimon had built a platform, a diversified financial services company with the scale, the resources, and the ambition to pursue even larger acquisitions and bolder strategic moves. The foundation had been laid in the unlikely setting of a commercial credit Baltimore backwater, strengthened by the Primerica acquisition, and now it was ready to support the next phase of growth. The stage was set for the dramatic expansion that would carry the company and both men to the very summit of American finance.